My parents spent $412,000 on my brother's wedding, and I paid for $11,000 of it myself, in cash, from an envelope I kept hidden inside a box of tampons in my childhood bathroom, because that was the only place in that house nobody ever looked. My name is Naomi Castellan. I am 31 years old. For 27 of those years, I cleaned my brother Julian's room, ironed his shirts, and cooked his meals while he studied nothing and became nothing, and my parents called it love. Comment below where you're watching this from, especially if you've ever been the invisible one in your own family. And if that's you, hit like and subscribe right now, because what happened at that wedding is going to make you understand exactly why some daughters stop forgiving. There were 3 things sitting under that wedding like landmines nobody else could see. The first was a manila folder I kept in a safety deposit box at Fifth Union Bank, 40 minutes from my apartment, containing 18 months of wire transfers I had traced back through 4 shell accounts, all of them touching money that belonged to my forensic accounting clients, and one of them, disturbingly, touching money that belonged to my own father. The second was a voicemail, 11 seconds long, saved on a burner phone charging in my glove box, in which my brother's fiance's mother said a sentence that had nothing to do with cake tastings or seating charts. The third was a photograph, printed and folded into 8s, tucked into the zipper pocket of the black clutch I would carry to that wedding. A photograph of my own face beside a face that should not have looked so much like mine. I want to take you back to the beginning because you need to understand the architecture of a house before you can understand why it eventually collapses. I grew up in a 6-bedroom colonial on Ashford Lane in a suburb of Hartford, Connecticut, the kind of street where the lawns competed quietly and the neighbors waved without meaning it. My father, Richard Castellan, was a partner at a regional insurance brokerage that made him look far wealthier than he actually was. A habit of appearance over substance that I would later learn ran in his blood like a second circulatory system. My mother, Diane, did not work, had never worked, and treated the absence of a paycheck as a kind of nobility, as though staying home to manage my brother's little league schedule was itself a form of aristocracy. Julian was born first, by 2 years, and from the moment I have any memory at all, the hierarchy was already fixed, poured in concrete before I could even object to it. I remember being 6 years old and watching my mother iron Julian's soccer uniform on a Tuesday night while I sat on the kitchen floor doing my own homework because there was no space left at the table. I remember asking why I couldn't have a uniform too, since I played on the same rec league, and my mother's exact words, which I have never once forgotten in 25 years, were, "Julian needs to look a certain way, Naomi. People expect things from boys like him. Nobody expects anything from you, and that's actually a gift if you think about it." I did not understand, at 6, that this sentence was a life sentence. I understood it fully only decades later, sitting in a courtroom parking lot with my hands shaking on a steering wheel. By the time I was 9, my chores were not chores in the way other children had chores. Other children took out the trash or fed a dog. I did Julian's laundry, separated by color, because my mother said doing it wrong would embarrass him at school. I packed his lunches, cutting his sandwiches into triangles because he refused rectangles, a preference nobody ever made him outgrow. I woke up 40 minutes before him every single school morning to make sure his backpack was ready, his homework was checked, his shoes were by the door, because if he was late, my mother would blame not Julian, but me, for failing in my role. That word, role, was used often in our house. My mother used it the way other families use the word chore, except a role, unlike a chore, was never temporary. A role was who you were. My father's contribution to this arrangement was silence, which in a house like ours was its own kind of vote. He worked long hours, came home smelling of aftershave and stale coffee, and when he did notice me, it was usually to ask why I hadn't finished folding Julian's laundry yet. I don't think my father hated me. I think if you had asked him directly, drunk on wine at some Christmas dinner, he might have said he loved me very much, in the specific way you love a tool that has never once broken. You don't thank a hammer for driving in the nail. You just reach for it again next time, and you're mildly annoyed if it isn't exactly where you left it. By the time I was 14, the phrase came. My grandmother, my mother's mother, a woman named Estelle who smoked long, thin cigarettes on our back porch and said whatever crossed her mind without apology, once asked my mother directly, in front of me, why I did so much for Julian and he did nothing for me. My mother did not hesitate. She set down her wine glass, looked at Estelle, and said, "Some children are born to lead, and some children are born to serve. It isn't cruelty, Mom. It's just how families work best. Julian leads, Naomi serves." She's good at it. I was standing 4 feet away, rinsing dishes, and I remember the water was too hot and I did not move my hands away from it because some part of me thought the burn was a more honest sensation than whatever was happening in my chest. I was 14 years old and I had just been told by my own mother in my own kitchen that my function in this family had been decided before I had any say in it, and it was to serve a brother who could not, at that point, make his own bed. There is a specific memory from 3 years earlier that I think explains the architecture of that house even more precisely. When I was 11, I won the Connecticut Junior Numeracy Challenge, a regional mathematics competition, beating 63 other students across 4 counties, and I remember running home clutching a small brass trophy shaped like a figure holding an oversized pencil, genuinely believing, in the specific, uncomplicated way children believe things, that this would finally be the achievement that made my parents look at me the way they looked at Julian after he scored a single goal in a rec league soccer game that half the neighborhood had attended. My mother glanced at the trophy for perhaps 4 seconds and said, "That's nice, sweetheart. Can you help me get the good tablecloth down? Julian's coach is coming for dinner tonight," and turned away before I had finished explaining what the competition even was. I placed the trophy on my own bookshelf myself. Nobody photographed it. 3 months later, when my mother reorganized my room to make space for storage boxes of Julian's old sports trophies that no longer fit in his own room, mine disappeared quietly into a donation bag without any discussion, and when I asked about it, confused in a way I didn't yet have language for, she said only, "Oh, I didn't think you'd mind. It's not like it does anything for you," a sentence I have never fully been able to explain to another adult without watching their face go still with discomfort. There is a specific memory from 3 years earlier that I think explains the architecture of that house even more precisely. When I was 11, I won the Connecticut Junior Numeracy Challenge, a regional mathematics competition, beating 63 other students across 4 counties, and I remember running home clutching a small brass trophy shaped like a figure holding an oversized pencil, genuinely believing, in the specific, uncomplicated way children believe things, that this would finally be the achievement that made my parents look at me the way they looked at Julian after he scored a single goal in a rec league soccer game that half the neighborhood had attended. My mother glanced at the trophy for perhaps 4 seconds and said, "That's nice, sweetheart. Can you help me get the good tablecloth down? Julian's coach is coming for dinner tonight," and turned away before I had finished explaining what the competition even was. I placed the trophy on my own bookshelf myself. Nobody photographed it. 3 months later, when my mother reorganized my room to make space for storage boxes of Julian's old sports trophies that no longer fit in his own room, mine disappeared quietly into a donation bag without any discussion, and when I asked about it, confused in a way I didn't yet have language for, she said only, "Oh, I didn't think you'd mind. It's not like it does anything for you," a sentence I have never fully been able to explain to another adult without watching their face go still with discomfort. Julian, for his part, absorbed this arrangement the way water absorbs into dry soil, completely and without resistance. He never once thanked me for the 11 years of lunches, the ironed shirts, the study guides I wrote for him in high school because he refused to read the textbooks himself. He developed, instead, a specific personality trait that would calcify over the next 2 decades into something almost architectural: entitlement, pure and unblinking. The kind that doesn't announce itself with cruelty, but with simple, total assumption. Julian assumed things would be done for him. He assumed rooms would be cleaned, meals would appear, problems would dissolve, because in 22 years of living in that house, they always had. I left for college at 18 on a partial academic scholarship that covered exactly 60% of tuition at the University of Connecticut, and my parents paid the other 40% for Julian's tuition at a private school in Boston that cost nearly triple what mine did. Without blinking, without discussion, because that too was simply how families worked best. I worked 2 jobs through college, one at a campus library for $9 an hour, and one tutoring high schoolers in algebra for $25, and I graduated with a degree in accounting and a minor in forensic auditing, a field I had fallen into almost by accident during a summer internship where I discovered I had a genuine, almost physical talent for finding the exact place where numbers stopped telling the truth. There is a particular feeling when you're tracing a ledger and you hit the seam where someone tried to hide something, a small, cold click in your stomach, like a lock turning. I chased that feeling for the rest of my life. By 26, I was a senior forensic accountant at a boutique firm in Stamford called Whitmore Ridley Associates, working primarily with private equity clients who needed due diligence done on acquisitions, meaning I spent my days finding exactly the kind of fraud that ruins men who think they're smarter than a spreadsheet. I was good at it. I was, by 29, the best in my department. and I was quietly, without any fanfare, making $194,000 a year, a number I never once mentioned at a family dinner, because I had learned early that my success made my mother uncomfortable in a way she never articulated but always displayed, through a subtle tightening around her eyes, a quick change of subject. Julian, meanwhile, had become a man who described himself as in finance without ever specifying what that meant, because what it meant, in practice, was that he had drifted through 4 jobs in 6 years, each one ending not through any dramatic failure but through a slow erosion of effort that eventually made him redundant. He lived at 33 in a 2-bedroom apartment in Greenwich that he could not have afforded on his actual income, a fact I only later understood the true mechanics of. He drove a car that cost more than my first 2 years of rent combined. He wore watches that, when I once idly appraised one at a family barbecue out of professional habit, I realized cost more than my entire emergency fund. And my parents looked at him with a pride so total it was almost religious, while I sat 2 seats down, having just closed a case that saved a client $11 million, and nobody asked me a single question about my work all night. It was at that same barbecue, in the summer I turned 30, that Julian announced his engagement to a woman named Priya Anand, and it was there, watching my mother cry actual tears of joy while barely making eye contact with me across the table, that something in my chest quietly, permanently, rearranged itself. Not into hatred. I want to be precise about this, because precision is the only skill I have ever fully trusted. It rearranged into clarity. I stopped, that night, trying to be loved by people who had already decided, before I could speak, what I was for. I started, instead, paying attention. Priya Anand was 28, the daughter of Rajiv and Meera Anand, a couple who had built a chain of 11 diagnostic imaging clinics across Connecticut and Massachusetts, a business worth, by my own quiet estimate, somewhere north of $30 million. Rajiv Anand was not a flashy man. He drove a Honda Accord that was 6 years old and wore the same 3 suits in rotation, a habit I would come to respect enormously, because in my line of work, the men who whisper their wealth are almost always the ones who actually have it, and the men who shout it are almost always compensating for a hole somewhere underneath. Priya herself was sharp, kind, in a way that seemed genuine rather than performed, and finishing her residency in dermatology at Yale New Haven. She was, in every observable way, too good for my brother, and I don't say that with bitterness. I say it as a professional observation, the kind I'd make about any 2 entities being merged that clearly did not belong on the same balance sheet. The engagement party was held at the Anand family's home in Westport, a sprawling property with a pool house bigger than the apartment I'd rented at 22, and it was there, drink in hand, making the kind of small talk I had trained myself to perform flawlessly over years of client dinners, that I first noticed something that made the cold click happen in my stomach, the same one I felt when a ledger stopped telling the truth. Julian was talking to Rajiv about the fund, gesturing vaguely, using phrases like diversified portfolio strategy and alternative asset allocation, language that sounded impressive to anyone who had never actually worked inside finance, but to me, sounded like a man reading vocabulary off a card he didn't understand. Rajiv, polite but not foolish, asked one direct question. What firm manages it? Julian's answer took 4 seconds too long, and when it came, it was a name I had never heard in 6 years of working adjacent to nearly every legitimate fund in the tri-state area. Meridian Crest Capital Partners. I did not say anything that night. I smiled, complimented the shrimp, and went home. And the next morning, before my coffee had even finished brewing, I ran a search on Meridian Crest Capital Partners through the same databases I used for client due diligence. Databases that cost my firm $11,000 a year in licensing fees, and I found exactly what my instincts had already told me I would find. Nothing. No SEC registration, no Form ADV. No physical office listed anywhere except a suite number at a shared workspace building in Stamford that rented desks by the month to anyone with a credit card. The website, when I found it, had been registered 9 months earlier and contained stock photography of skyscrapers that, on reverse image search, I traced to a stock photo site based in Belarus. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think honesty is the only currency that actually matters in a story like this. I did not feel triumph. I felt a strange, heavy grief, the specific grief of confirming something you already suspected, the way you feel when a biopsy comes back exactly as bad as you feared. Because if Julian was running money through something called Meridian Crest, and Julian did not have the intelligence, patience, or discipline to run so much as a lemonade stand, that meant one of two things. Either Julian was the architect of a fraud far more sophisticated than anything I'd seen from him in 33 years, which I doubted, or Julian was a face, a puppet, being used by someone smarter, someone who understood that a charming, entitled man with a trusting extended family made an excellent front. I spent the next 6 weeks doing what I do best, quietly, methodically, after hours, using nothing but publicly available records and the professional instincts I'd spent a decade sharpening. I started with property records and found that Julian's Greenwich apartment, the one he could not have afforded on any documented income, was not in his name at all. It was owned by a limited liability company called Ashford Holdings Group, a name that made my stomach drop, because Ashford was the name of the street I grew up on, the street my father had lived on for 31 years. Ashford Holdings Group had been formed 14 months earlier, and its registered agent, buried 3 layers down in a public filing that most people would never think to click through, was a name I recognized instantly: Richard Castellan, my father. I sat with that discovery for 3 full days before I let myself do anything with it. I sat with it the way you sit with a diagnosis, letting your body catch up to what your mind already understood. My father, a man who had spent 30 years complaining about the cost of my college textbooks, who had once made me pay him back $19 for a parking ticket he claimed I'd caused by asking to be picked up late from a friend's house, had quietly formed a holding company to fund an apartment for a son running money through a fraudulent investment fund. The question was no longer whether something illegal was happening. The question was how deep it went, and how much of my own family's apparent wealth, the wealth that had funded Julian's watches and his car and his $400,000 wedding, was actually built on money that belonged to somebody else. Before I told even Rosalind what I'd found, I spent an additional 2 weeks doing something I think of, professionally, as adversarial self-checking, essentially building the strongest possible counter-argument against my own findings, and then trying, systematically, to disprove it, because I have seen, across a decade of forensic work, how easily confirmation bias can turn a coincidence into a conspiracy in the mind of an investigator who wants too badly to be right. I considered, seriously, whether Ashford Holdings Group could be an entirely legitimate real estate investment my father had simply never mentioned, a common enough occurrence among people of his generation who distrusted discussing money openly with their children. I pulled the LLC's full filing history, its tax documentation where publicly available, its property tax records, looking specifically for any evidence of legitimate income sources that could explain the apartment's financing independent of Meridian Crest. I found none. Every dollar I could trace into Ashford Holdings originated, directly or through one clearly deliberate intermediary transfer, from the same 4 elderly investors' accounts, a pattern too clean, too consistent, to be coincidental. And it was only after I had genuinely, rigorously tried and failed to find an innocent explanation that I allowed myself to accept what the evidence was actually telling me. I also want to describe the specific physical toll that 6-week period took on me, because I think people sometimes imagine forensic investigation as a purely intellectual exercise, cool and detached, and it is not when the subject is your own family. I lost 11 pounds over those 6 weeks, without trying, simply because my appetite disappeared along with any sense of safety in my own history. I developed a tremor in my left hand that my doctor, when I finally saw her 3 months later for an unrelated checkup, attributed almost certainly to sustained cortisol exposure, the body's chemical response to prolonged, unresolved threat, and she asked, gently, whether I'd been under unusual stress, and I told her, truthfully, that I had, without elaborating on what kind. I slept during that period an average of 4.5 hours a night, waking repeatedly at exactly 3 in the morning, a specific hour I've since learned is common among people processing acute psychological threat, my mind apparently unable to fully rest, while some deeper part of it kept running the same calculations over and over, checking and rechecking a conclusion I desperately wanted to be wrong. Before I told even Rosalind what I'd found, I spent an additional 2 weeks doing something I think of, professionally, as adversarial self-checking, essentially building the strongest possible counter-argument against my own findings and then trying, systematically, to disprove it. Because I have seen, across a decade of forensic work, how easily confirmation bias can turn a coincidence into a conspiracy in the mind of an investigator who wants too badly to be right. I considered, seriously, whether Ashford Holdings Group could be an entirely legitimate real estate investment my father had simply never mentioned, a common enough occurrence among people of his generation who distrusted discussing money openly with their children. I pulled the LLC's full filing history, its tax documentation where publicly available, its property tax records, looking specifically for any evidence of legitimate income sources that could explain the apartment's financing independent of Meridian Crest. I found none. Every dollar I could trace into Ashford Holdings originated directly or through one clearly deliberate intermediary transfer, from the same four elderly investors' accounts, a pattern too clean, too consistent, to be coincidental, and it was only after I had genuinely, rigorously tried and failed to find an innocent explanation that I allowed myself to accept what the evidence was actually telling me. I also want to describe the specific physical toll that 6-week period took on me, because I think people sometimes imagine forensic investigation as a purely intellectual exercise, cool and detached, and it is not. Not when the subject is your own family. I lost 11 pounds over those 6 weeks, without trying, simply because my appetite disappeared along with any sense of safety in my own history. I developed a tremor in my left hand that my doctor, when I finally saw her 3 months later for an unrelated checkup, attributed almost certainly to sustained cortisol exposure, the body's chemical response to prolonged, unresolved threat, and she asked, gently, whether I'd been under unusual stress, and I told her, truthfully, that I had, without elaborating on what kind. I slept, during that period, an average of 4.5 hours a night, waking repeatedly at exactly 3 in the morning, a specific hour I've since learned is common among people processing acute psychological threat. My mind apparently unable to fully rest while some deeper part of it kept running the same calculations over and over, checking and rechecking a conclusion I desperately wanted to be wrong. I pulled the thread further and it kept unspooling. Working weekends, telling my own fiancé at the time, a kind but oblivious man named Marcus I would later break things off with, partly because he could never understand why I spent my Saturdays doing spreadsheets for fun. I traced 18 months of wire activity connected to Ashford Holdings and Meridian Crest, cross-referencing incorporation dates, registered agents, and banking relationships using the same forensic methodology I used professionally. Except this time, the target was my own bloodline. I found 4 separate individuals, all retirees, all in their late 60s and 70s, all connected to my parents' country club, who had wired a combined total of $1,140,000 into Meridian Crest over the previous 14 months. Believing they were investing in a diversified fund that Julian, at country club dinners and church fundraisers, had personally recommended, using my father's credibility as collateral, since Richard Castellan had, after all, been a respected face at that club for 3 decades. I should tell you more about Marcus, because the end of that relationship, while not central to this story, taught me something important about the specific damage that House had already done to me long before I ever opened a single financial record. Marcus and I had been together for 3 years, engaged for 8 months, a gentle, patient man who worked as a high school physics teacher and had never once, in 3 years, raised his voice at me, a fact I only recognized as remarkable in hindsight, having grown up in a house where raised voices, or worse, cold, deliberate silences, were simply the ambient weather. Marcus proposed on a Tuesday. No elaborate production, simply a quiet dinner at the small Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date. And I remember saying yes and feeling, underneath the genuine happiness, a strange, persistent unease I couldn't name at the time, a suspicion that I didn't fully deserve the specific gentleness he offered so consistently. When the investigation began consuming my nights and weekends, Marcus noticed, of course, the way any observant partner would, and he asked, gently, repeatedly, what was wrong, and I lied to him, repeatedly, telling him it was simply a demanding case at work. A lie that technically wasn't false, but was, in every way that mattered, a total evasion of what was actually happening. Marcus deserved honesty. I gave him deflection, because some deep, unexamined part of me had learned, in that house on Ashford Lane, that the people you love are not actually safe repositories for your real burdens, that vulnerability is simply another form of inconvenience you inflict on people who have better things to do. We broke things off 4 months before the wedding, not through any dramatic fight, but through a slow, sad recognition, voiced mostly by Marcus, that I had built a wall around some central part of myself that he could not get past no matter how patiently he waited outside it. I don't think you trust anyone enough to actually need them, Naomi, he told me, the night we ended things, sitting on the same couch where he'd proposed. And I don't think that's your fault. I just don't think I can keep loving someone who won't let me help carry anything. I did not argue with him. I knew, even as he said it, that he was entirely right. And losing Marcus, more than almost anything else in this entire story, is the cost I still think about most. On quiet nights, the one casualty of that house I never got to present as evidence in any courtroom, because grief like that doesn't have a docket number. I should tell you more about Marcus, because the end of that relationship, while not central to this story, taught me something important about the specific damage that house had already done to me long before I ever opened a single financial record. Marcus and I had been together for 3 years, engaged for 8 months, a gentle, patient man who worked as a high school physics teacher and had never once, in 3 years, raised his voice at me, a fact I only recognized as remarkable in hindsight, having grown up in a house where raised voices, or worse, cold, deliberate silences, were simply the ambient weather. Marcus proposed on a Tuesday, no elaborate production, simply a quiet dinner at the small Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date. And I remember saying yes and feeling, underneath the genuine happiness, a strange, persistent unease I couldn't name at the time. A suspicion that I didn't fully deserve the specific gentleness he offered so consistently. A suspicion I now recognize, with the clarity of distance, as the direct residue of 27 years spent being told my worth was conditional, transactional, tied to usefulness rather than simply existing. When the investigation began consuming my nights and weekends, Marcus noticed, of course, the way any observant partner would, and he asked, gently, repeatedly, what was wrong, and I lied to him, repeatedly, telling him it was simply a demanding case at work, a lie that technically wasn't false, but was, in every way that mattered, a total evasion of what was actually happening. Marcus deserved honesty. I gave him deflection because some deep, unexamined part of me had learned, in that house on Ashford Lane, that the people you love are not actually safe repositories for your real burdens, that vulnerability is simply another form of inconvenience you inflict on people who have better things to do. We broke things off 4 months before the wedding, not through any dramatic fight, but through a slow, sad recognition, voiced mostly by Marcus, that I had built a wall around some central part of myself that he could not get past no matter how patiently he waited outside it. I don't think you trust anyone enough to actually need them, Naomi, he told me, the night we ended things, sitting on the same couch where he'd proposed. And I don't think that's your fault. I just don't think I can keep loving someone who won't let me help carry anything. I did not argue with him. I knew, even as he said it, that he was entirely right. And losing Marcus, more than almost anything else in this entire story, is the cost I still think about most. On quiet nights, the one casualty of that house I never got to present as evidence in any courtroom, because grief like that doesn't have a docket number. The money did not go into any fund. It went, in traceable increments I documented meticulously in a spreadsheet I kept encrypted on a drive that never touched my work laptop, into 3 places. 22% went to Ashford Holdings Group, funding Julian's apartment and, I discovered later, a second undisclosed property in Vermont. 31% went to a private banking account jointly held by my father and a woman whose name I did not recognize at first. A woman named Sylvia Cho, until I found a single credit card statement, accidentally left on my parents' kitchen counter during a Sunday dinner, that listed a recurring monthly charge to a boutique hotel in Providence, Rhode Island, charged on a card that was not my mother's. The remaining 47%, the largest share, went into an account structure so deliberately layered, so carefully obscured through 2 shell entities in Delaware, that it took me 9 additional weeks and a paid consultation with a colleague specializing in asset tracing, conducted under a fake client name so nothing would trace back to me, to determine where it ultimately landed. It landed in an account controlled entirely, solely, by my brother Julian. I want to tell you specifically how I found the 4 investors, because the process itself is part of why this case became, months later, something the FBI described as unusually well documented for evidence gathered by a private citizen. I started with the country club's charity gala guest list from the previous 18 months, obtained legitimately through a public records request tied to the club's nonprofit filing status, and cross-referenced it against small, unusual property liens and reverse mortgages that had appeared in county records during the same window, a pattern I recognized instantly from professional experience, because elderly people liquidating assets in irregular, urgent-seeming ways is one of the most reliable early indicators of financial exploitation in my entire field. Harold Bregman, the retired dentist, had taken out a reverse mortgage on his home 11 months earlier that yielded him $190,000, a sum that matched, almost to the dollar, a wire transfer I had already traced into Meridian Crest 3 weeks after the mortgage closed. Wanda Pruitt, a retired schoolteacher, had liquidated a modest but carefully built retirement account worth $211,000. Money she'd spent 31 years as an educator accumulating, and wired the majority of it, $202,000, into the same fund within the same month. Alton Reyes, a widowed pharmacist, and Frank DiMaggio, a semi-retired contractor, had each contributed smaller but still devastating amounts, $74,000 and $63,000 respectively, both citing, in emails I obtained through a source at their shared financial advisory firm who agreed to speak with me off the record after I explained what I'd found, a recommendation from a young man at the club whose family they trusted. I did not contact any of the four investors directly during my investigation, on Rosalind's explicit advice, since doing so risked being construed as witness tampering, but I built detailed profiles of each of them anyway, their careers, their families, the specific shape of what they stood to lose, because I needed, I think, to hold the full human weight of what I was investigating, rather than let it remain an abstraction made of account numbers and wire transfer dates. Wanda Pruitt had a photograph on her public Facebook profile, taken at her retirement party 6 years earlier, of her standing in front of a classroom holding a handwritten card from a student that read, in a child's careful print, "Best teacher ever, thank you for believing in me." And I remember looking at that photograph at 2 a.m, alone in my apartment, and thinking about the specific, layered cruelty of a scheme that targets people precisely because their entire lives have trained them to trust warmly, to believe recommendations from people who share their social circle. I want to tell you specifically how I found the four investors, because the process itself is part of why this case became, months later, something the FBI described as unusually well documented for evidence gathered by a private citizen. I started with the country club's charity gala guest list from the previous 18 months, obtained legitimately through a public records request tied to the club's nonprofit filing status, and cross-referenced it against small, unusual property liens and reverse mortgages that had appeared in county records during the same window, a pattern I recognized instantly from professional experience, because elderly people liquidating assets in irregular, urgent-seeming ways is one of the most reliable early indicators of financial exploitation in my entire field. Harold Bregman, the retired dentist, had taken out a reverse mortgage on his home 11 months earlier that yielded him $190,000, a sum that matched, almost to the dollar, a wire transfer I had already traced into Meridian Crest 3 weeks after the mortgage closed. Wanda Pruitt, a retired schoolteacher, had liquidated a modest but carefully built retirement account worth $211,000, money she'd spent 31 years as an educator accumulating, and wired the majority of it, $202,000, into the same fund within the same month. Alton Reyes, a widowed pharmacist, and Frank DiMaggio, a semi-retired contractor, had each contributed smaller but still devastating amounts, $74,000 and $63,000 respectively, both citing, in emails I obtained through a source at their shared financial advisory firm who agreed to speak with me off the record after I explained what I'd found, a recommendation from a young man at the club whose family they trusted. I did not contact any of the four investors directly during my investigation, on Rosalind's explicit advice, since doing so risked being construed as witness tampering, or worse, could tip off my father before the FBI's own timeline was ready. But I built detailed profiles of each of them anyway, their careers, their families, the specific shape of what they stood to lose, because I needed, I think, to hold the full human weight of what I was investigating, rather than let it remain an abstraction made of account numbers and wire transfer dates. Wanda Pruitt had a photograph on her public Facebook profile, taken at her retirement party 6 years earlier, of her standing in front of a classroom, holding a handwritten card from a student that read, in a child's careful print, "Best teacher ever, thank you for believing in me." And I remember looking at that photograph at 2 a.m, alone in my apartment, and thinking about the specific, layered cruelty of a scheme that targets people precisely because their entire lives have trained them to trust warmly, to believe recommendations from people who share their social circle, to assume, reasonably, that a respected family's son would not lie to them at a fundraising dinner. I want to pause the financial thread here, because while I was building this case, quietly, at night, with the door of my apartment locked and 3 monitors glowing at 2 a.m, I was also still living inside the family, still attending dinners, still absorbing the specific texture of each person's cruelty, because cruelty, I've learned, has texture, has a signature, the way handwriting does, and I want you to understand each of these people the way I came to understand them, because it matters for what happens later. My mother's sister, my Aunt Colette, had a habit she performed at nearly every family gathering for as long as I could remember, and it was this. She would find some small, specific way to remind me of my place, disguised as a compliment. At Julian's engagement dinner, she took my hand across the table, looked at my short, unpolished nails, chewed down from years of typing through 12-hour audit deadlines, and said, in front of 11 people, "You know, Naomi, it's sweet that you don't bother with all that. Some women just aren't built for the spotlight, and honestly, there's a kind of peace in that, don't you think?" Julian was always going to be the one people looked at. Arrogance was Colette's engine. Not loud arrogance, not the kind that announces itself, but the quiet, condescending kind that dresses itself as warmth while filing you neatly into a lower category. Every single time, without exception, for 20 years running. My father's brother, Uncle Ted, operated on pure, uncomplicated entitlement, the same trait Julian had inherited like a genetic marker. Ted had borrowed, over the years, a total of $43,000 from my parents, none of it ever repaid, and he treated every family gathering as an opportunity to remind everyone, unprompted, of his various business ventures that were always, perpetually, one investment away from success. At the same engagement dinner, Ted cornered me by the bar and asked, without preamble, whether I could look over a business plan for a car wash franchise he was considering, then added, before I could answer, "Actually, don't worry about it. I'll have Julian's guy look at it. He's plugged into real money now." Real money. I smiled and excused myself to the bathroom, where I sat on the closed lid of the toilet for 4 minutes, breathing, doing the math on how a man who had never held a job longer than 14 months had become, in my own family's eyes, more financially credible than a licensed forensic accountant who had spent a decade building an actual career. Then there was Sylvia Cho, the woman from the credit card statement, who I finally met properly at a Sunday dinner 6 weeks before the wedding, introduced to the family as a business associate of your father's, a phrase so thin it was almost funny, given that I now knew, with documentary certainty, that Sylvia Cho had checked into the Wayfarer Hotel in Providence with my father on 9 separate occasions over the previous year, each visit corresponding precisely to a withdrawal from the Ashford Holdings account. Sylvia's fixed trait, if I had to name it in one word, was opportunism, pure and calculating. She asked me, over dinner, with a smile that never reached her eyes, what I did for work, and when I told her, briefly, forensic accounting, she said, "Oh, how tedious, finding other people's mistakes all day," and I watched my father's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, and I understood, in that exact second, that Sylvia Cho knew more about what I did for a living, and why it might matter to her specifically, than she was letting on. The fourth secondary antagonist, and the one whose betrayal cut differently, was my brother's best man, a childhood friend of Julian's named Trevor Ashcombe, who I had in fact dated briefly at 24, a relationship that ended not badly but simply, without drama, when I moved for a job and he didn't want long distance. Trevor's fixed trait was laziness dressed up as charm, the specific kind of man who could talk his way through a room while contributing nothing to it. And Trevor, I discovered during my investigation, was the one who had actually opened the Meridian Crest business bank account, using his own name as the listed officer, because Julian, apparently, had a prior credit issue that would have raised red flags at the bank. Trevor had done this, I learned from a source at the bank I cultivated carefully over 3 lunches, in exchange for a flat fee of $30,000 and a promise, never fulfilled, of equity in whatever Meridian Crest eventually became. Trevor was not a mastermind. Trevor was simply lazy enough and greedy enough to sign where he was told to sign. I want to give you a second scene with each of these 4, because the patterns repeated with a consistency that, in hindsight, I found almost clinically reassuring, the way a diagnosis becomes easier to accept once you've seen the symptom present itself more than once. 2 months after the engagement dinner, at a bridal shower planning brunch I attended purely out of obligation, Aunt Colette cornered me again near the coffee station and delivered a second variation on the same theme, this time examining my outfit, a simple navy blazer I'd worn directly from a client meeting, and saying, "Oh, you came from work. Of course you did. You always look so put together for the office. It's a shame you don't dress like this for family things. Though I suppose someone practical has to be the one who remembers to bring the good folding chairs." Arrogance, again, wearing the exact same disguise. Condescension folded so precisely into a compliment that most people in the room simply laughed along without registering the insult buried at its center. Uncle Ted's second scene came at the same bridal shower brunch. where he approached me near the gift table and asked, this time, whether I might be willing to front him $8,000 for what he described as a sure thing involving a friend's cryptocurrency mining operation in upstate New York, adding, when I declined politely, come on, Naomi, you make good money doing your spreadsheet thing. It's not like you've got kids or a mortgage eating into it. What else are you even saving for? The entitlement in that sentence, the casual assumption that my unmarried, childless life meant my earnings existed as a kind of communal resource rather than something I had built through a decade of 80-hour weeks and skipped vacations, was so total, so unexamined, that I simply said I'd think about it and never mentioned it again. Sylvia Cho's second scene was quieter, more calculated, occurring at a dinner 4 weeks before the wedding, where she maneuvered herself into the seat directly beside me and spent 20 minutes asking pointed, oddly specific questions about my work, whether forensic accountants ever got subpoenaed to testify, whether client confidentiality could ever be legally overridden, questions that felt, at the time, like idle curiosity, but that I understood, months later, reviewing the timeline, as Sylvia quietly trying to assess how much personal risk she carried from my proximity to my father's business dealings. Trevor's second scene happened at the rehearsal dinner itself, 2 days before the wedding, where he approached me at the bar, clearly several drinks in, and said, with the specific loose-lipped carelessness of a man who had never once faced consequences serious enough to teach him caution, between us, Meridian's about to blow up huge. Julian's letting me in on a bigger piece once the next round of investor money clears. You should think about getting in too. Family discount. A sentence that would have been almost darkly comic if I hadn't already known, with complete certainty, that the FBI's warrants were sitting ready, waiting only for the wedding date to arrive. I want to give you a second scene with each of these four, because the patterns repeated with a consistency that, in hindsight, I found almost clinically reassuring, the way a diagnosis becomes easier to accept once you've seen the symptom present itself more than once. 2 months after the engagement dinner, at a bridal shower planning brunch I attended purely out of obligation, Aunt Colette cornered me again near the coffee station and delivered a second variation on the same theme, this time examining my outfit, a simple navy blazer I'd worn directly from a client meeting, and saying, "Oh, you came from work, of course you did, you always look so put together for the office. It's a shame you don't dress like this for family things, though I suppose someone practical has to be the one who remembers to bring the good folding chairs." Arrogance, again, wearing the exact same disguise, condescension folded so precisely into a compliment that most people in the room simply laughed along without registering the insult buried at its center. And I remember thinking, standing there holding a coffee I didn't want, that Colette's entire personality was a closed loop, a single note played in a slightly different key at every gathering, and that I had simply never had the vocabulary, until that year, to name what I was hearing. Uncle Ted's second scene came at the same bridal shower brunch, where he approached me near the gift table and asked, this time, whether I might be willing to front him $8,000 for what he described as a sure thing involving a friend's cryptocurrency mining operation in upstate New York, adding, when I declined politely, come on, Naomi, you make good money doing your spreadsheet thing. It's not like you've got kids or a mortgage eating into it. What else are you even saving for? The entitlement in that sentence, the casual assumption that my unmarried, childless life meant my earnings existed as a kind of communal resource rather than something I had built through a decade of 80-hour weeks and skipped vacations, was so total, so unexamined, that I simply said I'd think about it and never mentioned it again, though I did make a note, later that night, in the same small notebook where I was tracking wedding logistics, because by then I had started tracking everything, out of habit, out of a professional instinct that told me every small data point eventually mattered. Sylvia Cho's second scene was quieter, more calculated, occurring at a dinner 4 weeks before the wedding where she maneuvered herself into the seat directly beside me and spent 20 minutes asking pointed, oddly specific questions about my work, whether forensic accountants ever got subpoenaed to testify, whether client confidentiality could ever be legally overridden, questions that felt, at the time, like idle curiosity, but that I understood, months later, reviewing the timeline, as Sylvia quietly trying to assess how much personal risk she carried from my proximity to my father's business dealings. Opportunism operating exactly as it always had, one careful, self-protective question at a time. Trevor's second scene happened at the rehearsal dinner itself, 2 days before the wedding, where he approached me at the bar, clearly several drinks in, and said, with the specific loose-lipped carelessness of a man who had never once faced consequences serious enough to teach him caution. Between us, Meridian's about to blow up huge. Julian's letting me in on a bigger piece once the next round of investor money clears. You should think about getting in too. Family discount. A sentence that would have been almost darkly comic if I hadn't already known, with complete certainty, that the FBI's warrants were sitting ready, waiting only for the wedding date to arrive, and that whatever bigger piece Trevor believed he was about to receive would instead be a federal indictment. By early spring, 4 months before the wedding, I understood the full shape of what I was looking at. My father had used his 3 decades of country club credibility to fund a fraudulent investment vehicle, laundering the proceeds through a holding company named after the street I grew up resenting, to support my brother's lifestyle and my father's affair. While my brother, incapable of running the fraud himself, had recruited a lazy childhood friend as a front, and my mother, whether through willful blindness or quiet complicity I still hadn't fully determined, continued planning a $412,000 wedding funded, I now suspected, at least partially by the same tainted account structure. I made one phone call before I made any other decision, and it was to a woman named Rosalind Vance, a litigator I had worked alongside on 2 prior forensic cases, a woman whose reputation in Fairfield County courtrooms was, without exaggeration, feared. Rosalind did not do sympathy. Rosalind did strategy, cold and total, and when I laid out what I had across a conference table at her office on a Tuesday evening with the blinds drawn, she listened without interrupting for 40 minutes, then set down her pen and said, "Naomi, you understand that if we do this the way I think you want to do it, there is no version where your family stays intact afterward." I told her I understood. She asked me one more question, the only question that actually mattered. "Do you want restitution or do you want justice?" I told her I wanted both, and she smiled for the first time that evening, a small, sharp thing, and said, "Good, those aren't the same thing, but I know how to get you both." I had first met Rosalind Vance 4 years earlier during a case involving a mid-sized manufacturing company suspected of misrepresenting inventory levels to secure a fraudulent loan extension. A case where I had served as the forensic accountant supporting her litigation team, and I remembered, even then, being struck by the specific quality of her attention, the way she listened to a room full of numbers the way most people listen to a confession, waiting patiently for the one detail that would unlock everything else. Rosalind was 54, twice divorced, by her own cheerful admission entirely uninterested in remarrying, and she kept a single-framed photograph on her office wall, not of family, but of the exact moment a jury foreperson had read a guilty verdict in the first major fraud case she'd ever tried, 26 years earlier, a photograph she said reminded her, on hard days, of exactly why she did this work. When I sat across from her that Tuesday evening, laying out 18 months of wire transfers and shell entity structures with the same clinical precision I would have used presenting to any client, Rosalind interrupted me only once, near the beginning, to ask a single question that told me everything about how she intended to handle this case differently than a stranger might. "Before you show me a single document," she said, setting down her coffee, "I need to know something that isn't in any spreadsheet. Are you doing this because you want your family destroyed? Or because you can't live with what you now know and staying silent would make you complicit in it?" I told her, honestly, that I hadn't fully separated those two motivations in my own mind yet, and Rosalind nodded slowly, unsurprised, and said, "That's fine. Most people who come to me with something this large haven't separated them either. But I want you to know, by the time we're done, you will have, because the strategy that serves genuine justice and the strategy that serves pure vengeance diverge at certain points, and I only build cases along the first path. If that's not what you want, there are other lawyers in this county who'll happily help you burn the whole thing down without asking questions. I'm not one of them, and frankly, Naomi, based on what I'm seeing in front of me, I don't think that's actually who you are either." That conversation, more than almost anything else in the 4 months that followed, shaped the specific character of everything I eventually did. Rosalind pushed back, repeatedly, whenever she sensed a decision I was making came from a desire to humiliate rather than a desire to see accurate consequences land where they belonged. When I first proposed timing the reveal to maximize public spectacle purely for its own sake, inviting local press, arranging for the DNA revelation to happen during the ceremony itself rather than the reception, Rosalind refused outright. "That's theater for your own catharsis, not justice for 4 elderly people who lost their savings," she told me flatly. You want it to land during the reception, after the vows, in front of witnesses who matter to the actual case, not orchestrated for maximum humiliation of a bride who hasn't done anything wrong. I'll help you get truth. I won't help you get spectacle. I pushed back initially, frustrated, still raw from months of carrying this alone, but within a week I understood she was right. And every choice I made after that conversation, including the specific mercy of letting Priya at least complete her vows before her entire world collapsed, came directly from Rosalind's insistence that precision, not cruelty, was the actual point. I had first met Rosalind Vance 4 years earlier, during a case involving a mid-sized manufacturing company suspected of misrepresenting inventory levels to secure a fraudulent loan extension, a case where I had served as the forensic accountant supporting her litigation team, and I remembered, even then, being struck by the specific quality of her attention, the way she listened to a room full of numbers the way most people listen to a confession, waiting patiently for the one detail that would unlock everything else. Rosalind was 54, twice divorced, by her own cheerful admission entirely uninterested in remarrying, and she kept a single framed photograph on her office wall, not of family, but of the exact moment a jury foreperson had read a guilty verdict in the first major fraud case she'd ever tried. 26 years earlier, a photograph she said reminded her, on hard days, of exactly why she did this work. When I sat across from her that Tuesday evening, laying out 18 months of wire transfers and shell entity structures with the same clinical precision I would have used presenting to any client, Rosalind interrupted me only once, near the beginning, to ask a single question that told me everything about how she intended to handle this case differently than a stranger might. "Before you show me a single document," she said, setting down her coffee, "I need to know something that isn't in any spreadsheet. Are you doing this because you want your family destroyed? Or because you can't live with what you now know and staying silent would make you complicit in it?" I told her honestly that I hadn't fully separated those two motivations in my own mind yet, and Rosalind nodded slowly, unsurprised, and said, "That's fine. Most people who come to me with something this large haven't separated them either. But I want you to know, by the time we're done, you will have, because the strategy that serves genuine justice and the strategy that serves pure vengeance diverge at certain points, and I only build cases along the first path. If that's not what you want, there are other lawyers in this county who will happily help you burn the whole thing down without asking questions. I'm not one of them, and frankly, Naomi, based on what I'm seeing in front of me, I don't think that's actually who you are either." That conversation, more than almost anything else in the 4 months that followed, shaped the specific character of everything I eventually did. Rosalind pushed back, repeatedly, whenever she sensed a decision I was making came from a desire to humiliate rather than a desire to see accurate consequences land where they belonged. When I first proposed, for instance, timing the reveal to maximize public spectacle purely for its own sake, inviting local press, arranging for the DNA revelation to happen during the ceremony itself rather than the reception, Rosalind refused outright. "That's theater for your own catharsis, not justice for 4 elderly people who lost their savings," she told me flatly. "You want it to land during the reception, after the vows, in front of witnesses who matter to the actual case, not orchestrated for maximum humiliation of a bride who hasn't done anything wrong. I'll help you get truth. I won't help you get spectacle." I pushed back initially, frustrated, still raw from months of carrying this alone, but within a week I understood she was right, and every choice I made after that conversation, including the specific mercy of letting Priya at least complete her vows before her entire world collapsed, came directly from Rosalind's insistence that precision, not cruelty, was the actual point. Rosalind connected me, through a contact from a prior case, to a senior financial crimes investigator at the FBI's New Haven field office, named Agent Priya Okonkwo Reyes, a coincidence of first names that Priya Anand, my future sister-in-law, would later find darkly funny given everything else. Agent Okonkwo Reyes reviewed my documentation over 2 separate meetings, each one lasting nearly 3 hours, and confirmed what Rosalind had already suspected. This was not a civil matter alone. This was wire fraud, elder fraud specifically, given the ages of the 4 investors, and possibly securities fraud, depending on how Meridian Crest had represented itself in its solicitations. And the FBI, Agent Okonkwo Reyes told me plainly, had been quietly building interest in Meridian Crest for 6 weeks already, after one of the elderly investors, a retired dentist named Harold Bregman, had filed a complaint of his own after growing suspicious of delayed distributions. My evidence, she told me, was the missing structural piece. What I had built independently, from nothing but instinct and access to public records, corroborated and completed an investigation the Bureau had already quietly opened. I did not tell anyone in my family any of this. Not one word, not one hint. For 4 months, I sat across from my mother at dinner and listened to her describe centerpiece arrangements. I sat across from my father and watched him complain about catering deposits, knowing exactly where the money for those deposits had originated. I watched Julian try on his tuxedo at a fitting I was invited to purely as an afterthought, and I complimented the fit, and I meant it as a kind of private joke that only I understood, because I already knew, by then, precisely which day this tuxedo would be photographed for the last time before an arrest. If you've made it this far, you already know what kind of person keeps building a case for 4 months while smiling through family dinners. And I think you understand exactly why. Hit subscribe now if you've ever had to sit across a table from someone and pretend you didn't already know how the story ends. Because what happens at that wedding is the part I've been waiting the entire video to tell you. But before I take you there, I need to tell you about the 11-second voicemail. Because Loop B, the personal betrayal, the one that had nothing to do with wire transfers and everything to do with the shape of my own face, started with a mistake made by a woman who had no idea I existed as anything more than the awkward, overlooked sister. Priya's mother, Meera Anand, called my mother 3 weeks before the wedding to discuss a detail about the seating chart, specifically whether my mother's side of the family, the Castellan cousins, should be seated near the Anand grandparents or kept separate given what Meera described. On a voicemail my mother never deleted and that I found while borrowing her phone to look up a caterer's number, as the resemblance issue with the daughter. I played that 11-second clip 4 times before I understood what I was hearing. Meera's voice, crisp and slightly rushed, said, "Diane, it's Meera. Quick thing, my father-in-law noticed something about Naomi's bone structure at the tasting. He swears she looks exactly like his cousin's side. I told him he's imagining things, but can we maybe not seat her directly across from the family portrait table? Just to avoid any comments, call me back." I sat in my mother's kitchen, phone in hand, and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me, the way it does when your body understands something a half second before your mind catches up. I had grown up being told my entire life that I looked like my father's side of the family, specifically like my paternal grandmother, a woman named Rosemary who had died when I was 9, a resemblance my mother referenced so often, so specifically, that I had never once questioned it. "You have Rosemary's chin," she'd say, almost mournfully, as though my face were a small, unwelcome inheritance. But Meera's father-in-law, a man named Deepak Anand, who I had met exactly twice, had apparently looked at me across a tasting table and seen not Rosemary Castellan, but a stranger from an entirely different family line. I did not confront my mother that day. I had learned, by then, 4 months into building the largest case of my professional life, that confrontation without proof was simply an invitation for someone smarter than you to build a better lie. So I did what I do. I found the photograph, the one Meera had apparently used for comparison, an old family portrait from a Diwali celebration the Anands hosted years earlier that my parents had somehow been invited to. A detail itself I hadn't known and found strange, given that our families had no prior connection before Julian and Priya's relationship began. I requested a copy from Priya directly, under the pretense of wanting old photos for the wedding slideshow, and when it arrived, I understood immediately what Deepak Anand had seen. Standing at the edge of that old photograph, barely in frame, was a man I did not recognize, a distant cousin of the Anand family named Arjun Malhotra, and the resemblance between his face and mine was not subtle. It was the kind of resemblance that makes strangers do a double take, the exact set of the eyes, the particular slope of the nose, a resemblance so specific it could not be coincidence. Not in any statistical universe I understood as a forensic professional, trained to distrust coincidence as a category. I sat with that photograph for 2 days before I did the only thing that made sense to someone who had built her entire career on demanding proof before belief. I ordered a DNA testing kit, the kind you spit into a tube, and I mailed a discreet, additional sample alongside it, one I collected from a coffee cup my father had left behind at a Sunday dinner, sealed carefully in a sandwich bag inside my purse, a detail I am not proud of but do not regret. Before I even received those results, I did what I always do. I researched Arjun Malhotra himself, needing, the same way I'd needed to adversarially test the financial evidence, to understand whether this resemblance pointed towards something coherent or whether I was simply pattern matching out of anxiety. Arjun Malhotra, I learned through a combination of public records and a cautious, roundabout conversation with a distant Anand cousin who had no idea what she was actually helping me confirm, had died 6 years earlier, at 58, of a heart attack, having spent most of his adult life working as a structural engineer in Hartford, unmarried, no children that any public record acknowledged, a quiet, private man by every account I could gather. He had, however, according to the cousin I spoke with, spent a significant stretch of the early 1990s working on a bridge renovation project in the same small Connecticut town where my mother's family had a modest lake house. A detail that lined up, with uncomfortable precision, against the timeline of the visiting relatives trip my mother had once mentioned taking alone, roughly 9 months before I was born. I sat with that timeline for a long time, tracing dates the way I trace wire transfers, looking for the exact seam where the official story stopped matching the evidence. And I found it, precisely where I suspected I would, in a gap of 4 months during which my mother had. According to an old datebook I found while helping Estelle clean out a closet years earlier and had never thought twice about at the time, listed no fewer than 6 unexplained day trips to that same small town, trips she had never once mentioned to me in 31 years of conversation about her past. The results took 11 days, and I remember exactly where I was when the email arrived, sitting in my car in the parking garage beneath my office building, engine off, because I could not make myself walk inside and open it at my desk. The report was clinical, bloodless, the way all the most devastating documents are. Probability of paternity, excluded. Richard Castellan was not, and I want to say this with the same clinical distance the report itself used, was not my biological father. I sat in that parking garage for over an hour. I did the math backward, the way I do math for a living, tracing dates, tracing a business trip my mother had once mentioned taking alone to visit relatives in the months before I was born, a trip I now understood was likely to see, or possibly to end things definitively with, a man named Arjun Malhotra's father, a relative who apparently lived in the same small circle the Anand family orbited, which was, I would later learn from Rosalind's careful, quiet inquiry, precisely how my parents had come to be invited to that long-ago Diwali celebration in the first place. My mother had kept a connection to that family for over 3 decades, hidden in plain sight, disguised as nothing more than an old acquaintance, and had said absolutely nothing when her son's engagement brought that same family circling back into orbit around us, gambling, I can only assume, that no one would ever look closely enough to notice. This is the part of the story where you'd expect me to say I felt destroyed, and I want to be honest instead of dramatic, because honesty is worth more than a good line. I did not feel destroyed. I felt disturbingly almost calm, because the DNA results did not create the coldness inside our family. They only explained it. 27 years of being treated as fundamentally lesser, as a servant rather than a daughter, suddenly had an origin point that made a terrible, clarifying sense. Richard Castellan had never fully loved me, not entirely because he was simply a cruel man by nature, though he was that too, but because on some level, conscious or not, he had always known I was not his, and Diane Castellan had spent 3 decades compensating for her own secret by elevating Julian, her one unquestionably biological child, into a prince, while quietly, methodically treating the evidence of her affair, meaning me, as staff. I called Rosalind that same night. She listened, again without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I have carried with me since. Naomi, you have spent 4 months building a case about stolen money. You just found out you're the one who was actually stolen from. Your entire childhood taken by 2 people who let you believe you were less than their son because it was convenient for their secret. The money case was always going forward. The only question now is whether you want the DNA result to come out too. And if you do, we need to think very carefully about how and when. I told her I already knew when. I told her I wanted it to come out in the same room on the same day as everything else, because I had spent 27 years being told some children are born to serve, and I wanted every single person who had ever repeated that sentence in my presence to watch it collapse in real time, in public, with witnesses, the same way my entire self-worth had been quietly dismantled in private, for decades, at kitchen tables where no one else was watching. Rosalind did not try to talk me out of the theatrics. She simply asked, practically, public venue, judicial timing, and simultaneous disclosure. Do you trust me to build that sequence? I told her yes. She told me the wedding, exactly as I suspected, was the only viable venue, given that Agent Okonkwo Reyes's investigation into Meridian Crest was now moving toward an active arrest phase, with warrants likely to be finalized within a narrow window that happened almost providentially to land 12 days before Julian's wedding date. Rosalind made one call to Agent Okonkwo Reyes, framed carefully within legal bounds, simply confirming timeline logistics, nothing more, nothing that could be construed as directing federal action for personal reasons. And Agent Okonkwo Reyes, a professional who had clearly seen every version of family fraud imaginable, said only, "If the warrants are ready and the subjects are all confirmed to be in one location, that's not manipulation, Ms. Vance. That's just good timing. We'll take it." I met Agent Priya Okonkwo Reyes in person for the first time 3 days after that phone call, at a nondescript conference room inside the FBI's New Haven field office, a room with fluorescent lighting and a whiteboard still faintly smudged with the ghost of some previous, unrelated case. She was younger than I expected, perhaps 41 or 42, with the specific, unhurried calm of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by what families were capable of doing to each other for money. She told me, during that first meeting, a detail I've thought about often since, that she had joined the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division specifically because her own grandmother had been the victim of an affinity fraud scheme 14 years earlier, losing nearly $60,000 to a scam run through her church community by a man everyone had trusted implicitly. "The thing people don't understand about this kind of fraud," she told me, leaning back in her chair, "is that it never works through strangers. It only works through people you already trust. Which means the investigators who catch it fastest are almost always the ones who understand betrayal from the inside, not just the outside." That's actually part of why your documentation was so unusually strong, Naomi. Most tips we get are angry and vague. Yours read like you'd already spent months forcing yourself to be fair to the evidence before you let yourself be angry about it. Over the following weeks, Agent Okonkwo Reyes and I developed a working relationship built on a specific, mutual respect I hadn't expected, given the enormous difference in our roles, and she walked me through, patiently, exactly how the Bureau builds a case of this scale, how affidavits get assembled, how a magistrate judge evaluates probable cause, how the timing of an arrest gets weighed against flight risk, evidence preservation, and the safety of everyone involved. She told me, near the end of our second meeting, something that stayed with me through the entire remaining lead-up to the wedding. "You're going to want this to feel like closure the moment it happens. Some clean, satisfying ending. I need you to understand now, before any of this unfolds, that it won't feel like that. Arrests are administrative. They're paperwork and procedure dressed up as drama. The actual closure, if it comes at all, comes months later, slowly, usually somewhere you don't expect it. I just don't want you walking into that ballroom thinking the handcuffs are the ending. They're just the beginning of the ending, and the beginning of an ending is almost never as satisfying as people imagine it will be." I did not fully believe her at the time. I believe her completely now. I want you to like and subscribe if you've ever discovered a truth about your own family that reorganized every memory you thought you understood. Because in the next part, I take you inside the 12 days before the wedding, the days where I had to sit in fittings, attend a bridal shower, and smile at people I now knew, with documentary and biological certainty, had built my entire identity on a foundation of lies. And I need you to understand exactly how cold a person can become when they've finally stopped hoping to be loved by people who were never capable of it. The 12 days before the wedding moved with a strange, syrupy slowness, the way time moves when you're holding two entirely separate lives in your hands and refusing to let either one show on your face. During the day, I went to work, closed out a case involving a mid-sized manufacturing firm that had been quietly overbilling a client for 2 years, a case that felt almost soothing in its smallness compared to what I was carrying at home. At night, I met with Rosalind in her office, the blinds always drawn, going over logistics with the kind of granular precision I recognized from my own audit work, because Rosalind, it turned out, thought exactly like I did, treating an entire wedding as a system with variables, timing, and failure points that needed to be controlled. The bridal shower happened on a Thursday evening at my mother's house. 17 women crowded into the same living room where I had once been told, at 14, that I was born to serve, and I sat through 3 hours of gift-opening mimosa toasts and games involving toilet paper wedding dresses, watching Priya laugh, genuinely, warmly, at something Colette said, and I felt, for the first time in the entire 4-month process, something close to guilt, not for what I was about to do to my family, but for what it would inevitably do to her. Priya had done nothing wrong. Priya was, as far as every thread of my investigation had confirmed, entirely unaware that her fiancé was the beneficiary of a laundering scheme run partly through her own future father-in-law's holding company. I made a decision that night, watching her open a set of monogrammed towels with my brother's future initials stitched into them, that whatever else happened, I would find a way to protect her from the worst of the fallout, even if I could not protect her from the truth itself. I called Agent Okonkwo Reyes the next morning and asked her directly whether Priya was a target of the investigation. She told me, plainly, that Priya Anand had no financial ties to Meridian Crest or Ashford Holdings whatsoever. that her name appeared nowhere in 18 months of transactional records, and that the Bureau had no interest in her beyond standard witness interviews. That was enough for me. I called Rosalind and told her I wanted the sequence of events at the wedding structured so that Priya's humiliation, whatever unavoidable amount there would be, happened as briefly and cleanly as possible, and Rosalind, to her credit, adjusted the plan without argument, moving the timing of the arrest to occur after the ceremony itself, but before the reception's formal dinner service, meaning Priya would at least, legally, already be married, a small mercy I insisted on and paid for later, privately, in ways I'll get to. 10 days before the wedding, I had a final dress fitting alongside Priya at a bridal boutique in New Canaan, and it was there, standing in a bridesmaid gown the color of dusty rose that Priya had chosen specifically, she told me, because sage green washes you out. But I noticed this brings out something warm in your face. A small, thoughtful observation nobody in my own family had made about my appearance in 3 decades, that I nearly told her everything. I stood in that dressing room, looking at my own reflection, at a face that belonged, I now knew, to a bloodline none of the Castellans actually shared, and I thought about Rosalind's warning, about how there was no version of this that let my family stay intact, and for one long, suspended moment, I considered simply walking away instead, taking my evidence to the FBI quietly, letting the arrest happen on some ordinary Tuesday with no audience at all, sparing Priya the public spectacle entirely. Then Priya adjusted the sash at my waist, smiled at me in the mirror, and said, without any idea of what she was actually saying, "I'm so glad Julian has a sister like you. He always says you're the responsible one, the one who actually holds things together." I thought about 27 years of iron shirts and forged smiles, and the moment of doubt closed as quickly as it had opened. 9 days before the wedding, my mother called me to discuss the seating chart in more detail, unaware that I had already heard, months earlier, the voicemail that started this entire second thread, and she mentioned, almost in passing, that Sylvia Cho would be attending as A+1 for your father's business partner. A lie so thin and unnecessary that I nearly laughed into the phone. I said nothing. I simply asked, casually, what table Sylvia would be seated at, and my mother told me, and I wrote it down in the small notebook I kept exclusively for wedding logistics now. A notebook that had nothing to do with flowers, and everything to do with the precise physical location of every person who needed to be in the room when the truth arrived. 7 days before the wedding, Rosalind called with confirmation that the arrest warrants for Julian Castellan, Richard Castellan, and Trevor Ashcombe, on charges spanning wire fraud, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and, specific to my father, elder financial exploitation given the ages of the affected investors, had been signed by a federal magistrate judge and were being held, at the Bureau's discretion, for execution at the earliest logistically sound opportunity. Rosalind told me Agent Okonkwo Reyes had one final question for me, relayed through her, which was whether I wanted to be present in the room when the arrests occurred, or whether I preferred to be elsewhere. Since witnessing a parent's arrest, she noted carefully, professionally, was something people sometimes regretted wanting to see. I told Rosalind to tell her I would be there. I had spent 27 years watching my family build a version of the world where I did not matter enough to witness. I intended to watch every second of the version where that stopped being true. 5 days before the wedding, I drove to Fifth Union Bank and retrieved the manila folder from my safety deposit box, the physical backup of everything I had already submitted digitally to Agent Okonkwo Reyes weeks earlier, and I sat in my car in the bank's parking lot and read through all 141 pages one final time. Not because I doubted any of it, but because I wanted, one last time before everything changed irreversibly, to hold the full weight of what my family had actually done in my hands, on paper, undeniable. $1,140,000 stolen from 4 elderly retirees. A 20-year affair hidden inside a real estate holding company named after my childhood street. A paternity concealed for 31 years behind the myth of a dead grandmother's chin. I folded the papers back into the envelope, drove home, and laid out the dusty rose bridesmaid dress on my bed, and for the first time in 4 months, I slept a full 8 hours without waking once. The morning of the wedding itself, I want to describe in more detail, because the ordinary rituals of that day carried a strange, doubled weight I couldn't have anticipated until I was actually living inside them. I woke at 6, before my alarm, and made coffee in my small kitchen the way I did every morning, the same brand, the same mug, a deliberate act of normalcy I performed almost like a ritual, because some instinct told me that if I let the enormity of the day fully register before I'd even had breakfast, I might not make it out the door at all. I laid Estelle's pearl earrings, the ones she would leave me 8 months later, though I didn't know that yet, on my dresser beside the small folded photograph and the printed DNA summary, both of which I would carry in my clutch. And I remember standing in front of my bathroom mirror for a long moment, studying my own face, the face Deepak Anand had recognized from across a tasting table months earlier, and thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, that by the end of the day, this specific, private face I'd spent 31 years believing belonged to one story would belong, publicly, to an entirely different one. I drove to Ridgeview Manor with the radio off, going over Rosalind's timeline one final time in my head. T-minus this, T-minus that, the same mental checklist I'd used for years walking into high-stakes client presentations. Except this presentation would end with federal agents leading my father out in handcuffs, rather than a signed engagement letter. I remember passing a small diner on Route 7, the same diner where my father used to stop for coffee on drives up to visit Estelle when I was a child, and feeling, for just a moment, an unexpected wave of grief for the family I'd never actually had. Not the one that was about to collapse, but the one I'd spent 31 years quietly hoping might still, someday, become real if I simply proved myself enough. That family had never existed. I understood that fully, finally, driving past that diner, and the grief I felt was not for what I was about to lose, but for what I now understood I had never actually possessed in the first place. 2 days before the wedding, my father asked me, at a final rehearsal dinner held at a country club I had grown up watching him perform Respectability Inside, to give a toast as the maid of honor's counterpart on the family side. A request that struck me, given everything I knew, as almost darkly funny. A man asking the daughter he'd helped disenfranchise financially and emotionally for 3 decades, to publicly celebrate the son he'd built that disenfranchisement to serve. I told him I would be honored. I meant something entirely different by the word than he understood. And I want you to sit with that, because in the next section, everything closes at once. In one room, in front of 240 guests, and none of it happens the way anyone standing in that ballroom expected it to. If you've stayed with me this long, you already know this isn't a story about a wedding ruined by an accident. It's a story about a wedding that became the exact courtroom I built it to be, 12 days in the making, and what happens next is the part I've been walking you toward since the very first sentence. Before I take you into that ballroom, if you've ever had to smile through a rehearsal dinner while sitting on a truth big enough to end your entire family, drop a comment with just the number of years you carried something like that, and hit subscribe now, because I promise you, what happens in the next 15 minutes of this story is the part everyone in my life still brings up, unprompted, years later. The wedding was held at the Ridgeview Manor, a converted 19th century estate in Litchfield County, with a ballroom that sat 240 guests beneath 3 enormous crystal chandeliers, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a garden already blooming with the specific white peonies Priya had chosen 8 months earlier. I arrived at 9 in the morning for hair and makeup, 4 hours before the ceremony, and I remember the smell of that room with total clarity, hairspray and lily perfume, and the particular staleness of a hotel suite air conditioner running too cold, because I remember thinking, absurdly, that I would carry that smell for the rest of my life the way some people carry the smell of a hospital. The ceremony itself, I'll be honest, I do not remember in detail because my mind was elsewhere the entire time, running through Rosalind's timeline the way I used to run through audit checklists before a big presentation, checking and rechecking each step. Priya walked down the aisle at exactly 1 in the afternoon in a dress the color of fresh cream, and Julian cried, actual tears, the first genuine emotion I had watched him produce in years, and some small, stubborn part of me, even then, felt a flicker of something like sorrow, because whatever else Julian was, a fraud, an entitled, hollow man who had let himself be used as a puppet for a scheme he barely understood, he did, in that specific moment, seem to love her. It did not change anything. It simply made the coldness required of me slightly heavier to carry. The reception began at 4, cocktail hour spilling out onto the garden terrace, and I positioned myself, as planned, near the edge of the terrace closest to the ballroom's side entrance. A location Rosalind and I had selected specifically because it offered a clear sightline to both the head table and the main entrance the federal agents would use. I checked my phone once, discreetly, at 4:40 and found a single text from Rosalind. In position, T-minus 40 minutes. I put the phone away and rejoined the conversation I'd been half listening to, which happened to be Aunt Colette explaining, unprompted, to a table of Anand relatives, that I was the quiet one, always better behind the scenes than in front of them. And for the first time in my entire life, I let myself smile at that sentence without flinching, because I knew, with total certainty, exactly how front and center I was about to become. I want to describe the specific quality of that cocktail hour, because I've never experienced anything quite like it since. An hour of ordinary, pleasant small talk layered directly on top of a countdown only I could hear. I spoke with Priya's college roommate about wedding cake flavors. I complimented a second cousin's toddler on his tiny bow tie. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and held it without drinking. The same way I would hold my untouched glass during the toast an hour later, because I needed my mind entirely clear. And the whole time, beneath every pleasant exchange, I was tracking, almost unconsciously, the exact position of every relevant person in that garden. My father laughing loudly near the bar with two old colleagues from the insurance brokerage. My mother fussing over a flower arrangement with the wedding planner. Julian with his arm around Priya's waist, both of them glowing in the specific unguarded way people glow in the last hour before their entire understanding of their own life gets rewritten. I remember thinking, watching them from across the terrace, that I was probably the only person in that garden who understood we were all standing inside the final scene of one story and the opening scene of an entirely different one, and that in exactly 70 minutes, nobody in that garden would remember this cocktail hour as anything other than the calm before everything changed. At 4:55, 5 minutes ahead of Rosalind's original estimate, I received a second text, this one simply reading, "Confirmed all 4 subjects on premises. Proceeding on schedule." I slipped my phone back into my clutch, beside the folded photograph and the printed DNA summary, and I walked back into the ballroom for dinner service, with a steadiness that, looking back now, still surprises me, because underneath that steadiness, my heart was moving fast enough that I could feel it in my throat. A physical sensation I recognized, distantly, as the same one I used to feel standing outside my parents' kitchen as a child, waiting to find out which version of the evening I was about to walk into. There is one more relationship I want to tell you about that grew out of that same terrace, because it emerged from an unexpected corner of this entire ordeal. Ingrid, the wedding planner who had stood frozen near the head table watching her meticulously organized reception collapse into federal procedure, reached out to me nearly 2 months later. An email that opened, almost apologetically, with, "I imagine you never want to hear from anyone connected to that day again, but I wanted to check that you were doing all right, because I've thought about you more than I probably should have." We met for coffee, awkwardly at first, 2 people bonded by having witnessed the same catastrophe from entirely different vantage points, and Ingrid told me something that surprised me. She said that in 11 years of planning weddings, she had seen every possible version of family dysfunction erupt at receptions. Drunken toasts turning into old grievances, exes showing up uninvited, parents refusing to sit at the same table, but she had never, not once, seen anyone handle a moment of total collapse with the specific, composed dignity I had shown that evening. "I kept waiting for you to fall apart," she told me, stirring her coffee slowly. "Everyone else in that room fell apart in some way, even the guests who had nothing at stake. You were the only person who looked like you'd been expecting it your whole life." I told her, honestly, that in a sense I had been, that 31 years of learning to keep my face composed while something painful happened around me had, unexpectedly, prepared me perfectly for the one day I actually needed that particular skill. Dinner service began at 5:15. I gave my toast at 5:30, standing at the head table with a glass of champagne I had not touched, looking out at 240 faces, my mother beaming in a pale blue gown, my father adjusting his cufflinks with the particular smugness of a man who believed, correctly as far as he knew, that he had gotten away with everything, and I said the words Rosalind and I had rehearsed 4 times the night before, words designed to sound, to every single person in that room except me, like an ordinary toast. "Julian, growing up, I spent more hours than I can count making sure you had what you needed. Ironed shirts, packed lunches, quiet support nobody ever really saw. I used to think that was just my role in this family. Today, I'm realizing something has been building for a very long time, and it's finally coming due." I raised my glass. The room clinked and drank, warmly, none of them understanding they had just applauded the opening statement of their own unraveling. At 5:48, exactly on schedule, 4 plainclothes agents entered through the side terrace doors, moving with the calm, unhurried efficiency of people who had done this exact walk 100 times before. Agent Priya Okonkwo Reyes at the front, badge already visible on her hip, 3 additional agents fanning out toward the head table, the bar, and the exit nearest my father's seat. The room did not understand what was happening for nearly 8 full seconds. A strange, suspended silence where 240 people simply watched four strangers in dark suits walk purposefully across a dance floor, and then Agent Okonkwo Reyes stopped directly behind my father's chair and said, clearly without any theater in her voice because she did not need any, "Richard Castellan, you're under arrest for wire fraud, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and financial exploitation of an elderly person. Please stand up slowly and place your hands where I can see them." My father did not move for a full 3 seconds, and in that silence, I watched every performance of respectability he had built over 3 decades collapse in real time across 240 witnesses, his face draining of color, his hand still gripping a fork he had been using to eat wedding cake he would never finish. My mother screamed, actually screamed, a sound I had genuinely never heard her make in 31 years, and lunged half out of her chair before Agent Okonkwo Reyes's colleague raised a hand and told her calmly to remain seated. A second agent moved simultaneously toward Julian, who stood frozen beside his brand new wife, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The exact posture I noted with something between pity and grim satisfaction, of a man discovering in real time that the thing he'd been told was safe had never been safe at all. "Julian Castellan, you're also under arrest. Same charges, please stand up." I want to describe the specific sound of that ballroom in the seconds that followed, because I've never fully been able to explain it to anyone who wasn't there. 240 people, mid-bite, mid-conversation, mid-toast, produced a sound that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite noise, a kind of collective intake of breath that seemed to hang in the air beneath the crystal chandeliers. And then, almost simultaneously, the specific electronic chime of dozens of phones being pulled from clutches and jacket pockets. People already beginning to record, to text, to whisper urgently to the person beside them, the whole room fracturing into 100 small, overlapping reactions at once. I saw a woman at table 6, someone from my mother's book club, stand halfway up with her napkin still tucked into her collar. I saw the wedding photographer, a young man named Desmond, who had been hired specifically to capture candid reaction shots throughout the reception, instinctively raise his camera and begin shooting the exact moment nobody had hired him to capture. And I learned months later, through Priya, that several of those photographs, stark and unposed, my father's face frozen mid-collapse, ended up submitted, with the family's reluctant permission, as visual evidence supporting the restitution hearing. A strange, unintended afterlife for wedding photography that had originally been meant to capture nothing but joy. I also want to tell you about the specific texture of my own toast, the one I delivered at 5:30, because I've thought back on the physical sensation of standing there, glass raised, more than almost any other single moment of that day. My hands, I remember, did not shake, a detail I noted almost clinically even as I was living it. A strange, split awareness of performing calm while genuinely, underneath it, feeling entirely calm. The two states finally fully aligned after months of forcing one to imitate the other. I could see, from the head table, the specific expressions on the faces closest to me, my mother's soft, proud smile, utterly unaware of what was coming, my father's slight, distracted nod, already reaching for his champagne before I'd finished speaking, Julian's genuine, warm smile directed up at me, the smile of a man who had never once, in 33 years, considered that his sister might be capable of anything other than quiet, permanent support. I remember thinking, delivering those final rehearsed lines, quiet support nobody ever really saw, that I was handing the entire room a key they didn't yet know they'd been given. A sentence that would recontextualize itself completely within the next 20 minutes. And there was a strange, private satisfaction in that, watching 240 people applaud words they believed were simple sentiment, unaware they were applauding the opening statement of an indictment. I want to describe the specific sound of that ballroom in the seconds that followed, because I've never fully been able to explain it to anyone who wasn't there. 240 people, mid-bite, mid-conversation, mid-toast, produced a sound that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite noise, a kind of collective intake of breath that seemed to hang in the air beneath the crystal chandeliers, and then, almost simultaneously, the specific electronic chime of dozens of phones being pulled from clutches and jacket pockets, people already beginning to record, to text, to whisper urgently to the person beside them, the whole room fracturing into 100 small, overlapping reactions at once. I saw a woman at table 6, someone from my mother's book club, stand halfway up with her napkin still tucked into her collar. I saw the wedding photographer, a young man named Desmond who had been hired specifically to capture candid reaction shots throughout the reception, instinctively raise his camera and begin shooting the exact moment nobody had hired him to capture, and I learned months later, through Priya, that several of those photographs, stark and unposed, my father's face frozen mid-collapse, ended up submitted, with the family's reluctant permission, as visual evidence supporting the restitution hearing. A strange, unintended afterlife for wedding photography that had originally been meant to capture nothing but joy. Trevor Ashcombe, seated 3 tables back beside a date he'd brought for the occasion, attempted, absurdly, to simply walk toward the exit as though he might slip out unnoticed, and the 4th agent intercepted him within 4 steps. And the sound of Trevor's chair scraping backward against the marble floor was, somehow, in that entire chaotic scene, the detail that has stayed with me most vividly, a small, undignified screech that seemed to summarize everything about the kind of man he'd always been, grasping for an exit that was never actually there. Priya turned to me, still in her wedding dress, mascara already beginning to streak, and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Naomi, did you know about this?" And this is the moment, if you're watching closely, where everything I had built for 4 months converged into a single choice about who I actually wanted to be. I could have lied. I could have performed shock alongside everyone else. Instead, I looked at her, at this woman who had chosen a dusty rose color specifically because it brought warmth to my face, who had shown me more genuine kindness in 8 months than my own mother had shown me in 31 years. And I said quietly, only for her, I've known for 4 months. I'm so sorry it happened today. Of all days, I tried to make sure it happened after the vows, at least. That much I could control. Priya stared at me for a long moment, and something in her face shifted, not toward anger, but toward a kind of stunned, exhausted understanding. And she said only, "Was any of it real? Does he actually love me underneath all of it?" I told her the truth, because she deserved that much after everything. I think he does. I don't think that changes what he did or what he let himself become, but I think that part at least was real. My mother, meanwhile, had turned her fury toward me with a speed that told me she'd already, in some instinctive animal part of her mind, understood exactly who was responsible for this, even before any explanation had been given. "What did you do?" she hissed, gripping my wrist hard enough to leave a mark I photographed later, for the record, out of pure professional habit. "What did you do, Naomi? What did you do?" And I looked at her, this woman who had told my grandmother, in my own kitchen, when I was 14 years old, that some children are born to serve, and I said the only sentence I had been saving, deliberately, for exactly this moment, the callback Rosalind and I had planned from the very beginning. "I didn't do anything, Mom. I just stopped serving." I want to describe what I actually felt saying that sentence, because I had rehearsed it, alone, in my apartment more times than I could count, and I had always imagined it would feel like triumph when the moment finally arrived. It did not. It felt instead like setting down something impossibly heavy that I had been carrying for so long my arms had simply forgotten what it was like to be empty. My mother's grip on my wrist loosened, not from any softening but from a kind of collapse, her whole body seeming to fold inward slightly, and I watched, in that specific second, 27 years of carefully constructed hierarchy simply evaporate, replaced by nothing, no new understanding, no sudden remorse, just a woman standing in the wreckage of a story she had told herself for so long that she had genuinely, I believe, forgotten it was a story at all rather than a fact of the universe. I did not feel the need to say anything else. I had spent my entire childhood explaining myself, justifying my worth, auditioning for a love that was never actually available on any terms I could meet, and in that single sentence, I finally understood that I owed her no further explanation. Not that day, and, as it turned out, not ever again. It was at that exact moment, with my father being led toward the terrace doors in handcuffs, with my mother's fingers still digging into my wrist, with the entire ballroom frozen in a kind of horrified, silent tableau, that Deepak Anand, Priya's grandfather, the 79-year-old patriarch who had first noticed the resemblance in my face months earlier at the tasting, rose slowly from his seat at the head table and walked toward me with the careful, deliberate steps of a man who had waited his entire dignified life to be right about something. He stopped in front of me, ignored my mother entirely, and said, in a voice that carried clearly across a ballroom that had gone almost completely silent except for the distant sound of my father being processed by federal agents near the doors, "I knew it the moment I saw you at the tasting." You have Arjun's exact eyes. I told Mira, I said, that girl is not a Castellan by blood. I would stake my life on it, and everyone told me I was imagining things because it was rude to say so. He turned then, deliberately, toward my mother and asked the question that finished the second loop, the one Rosalind and I had agreed would land publicly regardless of how my father's arrest played out, because I had told her, weeks earlier, that I refused to let this specific truth stay buried simply because the financial crime provided enough drama on its own. Diana, is it true? Is this young woman my late cousin Arjun's daughter? I want to tell you about that tasting, months earlier, because at the time I had no idea I was being observed so closely. It happened at a small catering studio in Westport. 6 of us crowded around a table sampling proposed wedding menu options, and I remember Deepak Anand sitting quietly at the far end, saying very little throughout the entire 2-hour session, occasionally glancing my way with an expression I registered, at the time, as simple polite interest, the kind an elderly relative might show toward a soon-to-be extended family member. I did not know until he told me himself in that ballroom months later that he had spent much of that tasting quietly studying my face against a memory of his own late cousin, a man he had grown up alongside in Pune before both families eventually settled in different corners of the United States, and that the resemblance had unsettled him enough that he'd brought it up privately to Mira on the drive home that same evening, only to be gently, dismissively waved off. I am an old man, he told me later at that anniversary dinner, laughing softly at himself. And old men are supposed to imagine things that aren't there. I nearly believed them. I nearly let it go. I am glad now that some stubborn part of me kept turning it over anyway. I have thought often about how easily that entire truth could have stayed buried if Deepak had simply let politeness win, if I had never found that voicemail, if any single thread in that 4-month investigation had frayed instead of holding. I don't believe in fate, not professionally, not personally, but I do believe, deeply, in the particular power of one person's stubborn refusal to accept a comfortable, incomplete story, and I think that refusal, more than any single piece of evidence I gathered, is the actual engine of everything that happened afterward. My mother's face went through 3 distinct stages in the span of about 4 seconds: denial, calculation, and finally, visibly, surrender. The specific surrender of a woman who understood that a room full of 240 witnesses, several of whom were now recording on their phones, was not a room where a lie could survive. It doesn't matter, she said weakly, which was, in its own way, more of a confession than any direct admission could have been. I stepped forward then, and I want you to understand that I did not raise my voice, not once, through any part of what came next, because Rosalind had taught me something true months earlier, that the coldest sentence in a room always lands louder than the loudest one. I reached into the small clutch I had carried all day, the black one with the photograph folded into 8ths in the zipper pocket, and I did not take out the photograph. I took out something else instead, a single folded sheet of paper I had printed that morning specifically for this purpose, the summary page of my paternity test results, and I held it up, not shouting, simply speaking clearly enough for the nearest tables to hear. It's true, I said. I found out 4 months ago, the same week I discovered my father's shell company was laundering elder fraud money to fund this wedding. Richard Castellan is not my biological father. He is not, and has never been, obligated to love me, and honestly, looking back at 27 years of ironing my brother's shirts while being told I was born to serve, maybe that explains a few things. But I want to be clear about something, for everyone in this room, because I think it matters more than anything else that's happened today. Diane Castellan knew this for 31 years and let me believe I was simply less loved because I deserved it. That was a choice. That wasn't biology. That was cruelty, dressed up as parenting for 3 decades, and I am done letting anyone in this family pretend otherwise. The room did not applaud, because rooms like that one do not applaud in moments like that one, but I watched something shift across 240 faces simultaneously, a specific, visible recalibration. The kind that happens when a story everyone thought they understood reveals itself to have been an entirely different story the whole time. Aunt Colette, 3 tables back, had gone the color of the tablecloth. Uncle Ted had quietly, almost comically, begun edging his chair backward, as though distance might somehow exempt him from association. Sylvia Cho, seated at table 12 exactly where my notebook had predicted, had already stood and was moving briskly toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, and I watched Agent Okonkwo Reyes's remaining colleague intercept her gently at the door, Not for arrest, since Sylvia herself faced no charges, but simply, I learned later, to confirm her identity for the ongoing investigation into how Ashford Holdings funds had actually been distributed, a detail that would matter considerably in the months that followed. I watched, in those same chaotic minutes, the specific unraveling of every secondary antagonist's carefully maintained persona, each collapse landing exactly where I would have predicted, given everything I'd learned about them over the preceding months. Aunt Colette, whose entire identity had been built around a kind of performed social superiority, spent the remainder of that evening attempting, with visible, flailing effort, to distance herself verbally from my parents to anyone who would listen, telling at least 3 separate tables, within my direct hearing, that she'd always found Richard a bit much. Honestly, a claim so transparently opportunistic, so immediately contradicted by 30 years of visible closeness, that even the strangers she said it to seemed to recoil slightly. Uncle Ted, for his part, simply left, quietly, without saying goodbye to anyone, and I learned later, through a cousin who witnessed it, that he had approached the valet stand and requested his car nearly 20 minutes before it was ready, then stood there, alone, in the gathering dusk, checking his phone repeatedly, presumably already calculating how quickly he could distance the $43,000 debt he'd never repaid from a family that had just become a very public liability. I did not feel triumphant watching any of this unfold, which surprised me, because some part of me had expected, after everything, to feel something closer to vindication as I watched these specific people scramble. Instead, I felt mostly a kind of exhausted clarity, the specific feeling of watching a system you'd studied for months, finally, predictably, behave exactly the way you'd calculated it would. No more satisfying than confirming a hypothesis in a spreadsheet, just quieter, sadder, and considerably more expensive in every currency that actually mattered. Julian, being let out a separate exit than my father to avoid the appearance of collusion during transport, turned back once, just once, and looked at me across the ballroom, and I want to describe his face honestly, because I've thought about it many times since. It was not anger, it was something closer to a child's face, uncomprehending, betrayed by a world that had always protected him so thoroughly, he had never once had to develop the capacity to protect himself. He mouthed something I couldn't fully hear across the distance, but I believe, from the shape of it, that it was why, and I did not answer because I had spent 27 years answering that exact question silently, through ironed shirts and packed lunches and a childhood spent proving my worth to people who had already decided I didn't have any, and I felt no obligation in that final moment to explain myself to him one more time. Priya, still standing in her wedding dress, mascara fully streaked now, watched her new husband being led away in handcuffs, watched her own grandfather confirm a decades-old affair, watched the family she had just legally joined implode across a single quarter hour, and she did something I did not expect and will never forget. She walked over to me, took my hand, the same wrist my mother had bruised minutes earlier, and said, quietly, "None of this is your fault. You spent your whole life protecting people who never protected you, and today you finally stopped. I'm still going to need time, probably a lot of it, but I don't blame you, Naomi. I think, if anything, I finally understand you." I realized standing there in that ruined ballroom, the single kindest thing anyone in either family had said to me in over a decade, and it came from the one person who had every reason in that specific moment to hate me instead. I want to step back briefly before I finish and tell you something about how my parents' own marriage began, a detail I only fully pieced together during the same months I was building the fraud case, because I think it explains, more than anything else, why my mother built the specific lies she built and maintained it for 31 years. My parents married young, my mother 22, my father 26, and I learned, through Estelle, in one of our final conversations before she passed, that my mother had, in fact, been involved with someone else in the months before that marriage, a relationship Estelle described only vaguely, protectively, even at the very end, saying simply, "Your mother had another life she was supposed to have, Naomi, before she chose the safer one instead." I always wondered if some part of her spent the rest of her life resenting that choice, and I always worried, watching how she was with you specifically, that some of that resentment landed somewhere it never should have. I did not push Estelle for more detail in that hospital room, sensing, correctly as it turned out, that she was offering me as much as she was willing to offer, a gentle, partial confirmation rather than a full account. But I understood, piecing it together later against the DNA results and the timeline of Arjun Malhotra's bridge project, that my mother had likely chosen, at 22, the safer, more socially secure path of marrying Richard Castellan over whatever life she might have built with a quiet structural engineer with no family money and no country club membership, and that when she discovered herself pregnant with a child that was very likely not her husband's, she had made a second choice, just as consequential as the first, to bury that truth so completely, so permanently, that even she, I suspect, eventually came to half believe her own performance of it. I think, in some complicated way I still do not have full peace with, that raising me as slightly, quietly lesser than Julian was my mother's way of managing a guilt she never once let herself name directly, punishing the physical evidence of a choice she'd made at 22, rather than examining the choice itself. And I think Julian, her one fully, unambiguously biological child, became not just a favorite but a kind of atonement, proof to herself that whatever she'd sacrificed by marrying my father had at least produced something she could point to with uncomplicated pride. This does not excuse what she did. I want to be entirely clear about that, because understanding the origin of cruelty is not the same as forgiving it, and I have worked hard, in therapy, to hold both of those truths at once without letting one collapse into the other. But understanding it did something important for me, in the months after the wedding, that I hadn't expected. It let me stop asking the question that had organized my entire childhood, what is wrong with me, and start asking a different, far more accurate question instead, what happened to her, long before I existed, that made this particular cruelty feel, to her, like the only available shape for love to take. The ballroom emptied slowly over the next hour, catering staff standing frozen with trays of untouched filet mignon, the wedding planner, a composed woman named Ingrid who had clearly never once trained for this specific contingency, quietly instructing the band to stop playing, the DJ cutting the reception's first dance song off mid-verse. I stood near the terrace doors for a long time after the agents left, watching the white peonies in the garden catch the last orange light of the evening, and Rosalind found me there eventually, placed a hand briefly on my shoulder, and said only, "You did that with more composure than anyone I've ever watched go through it. Go home, Naomi. Sleep. There's a great deal of work ahead, but none of it happens tonight." I let her drive me home. I did not cry that night, not because I was still performing coldness, but because some deeper, more exhausted part of me had simply run out of anything left to spend on tears. And instead, I slept for 11 hours straight, the longest uninterrupted sleep I'd had in over 4 months. I want to walk you through what happened in the months that followed, because the epilogue of this story, I think, matters just as much as the wedding itself, since it's the part that actually answers the question of whether truth, pursued this coldly, this deliberately, actually produces anything like justice, or whether it simply produces a different kind of wreckage. My father, Richard Castellan, was formally charged 11 days after the wedding with wire fraud, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and financial exploitation of an elderly person, charges that carried, combined, a potential sentence of up to 22 years, though his attorney negotiated a plea agreement 9 months later that resulted in a 6-year federal sentence, a restitution order requiring him to repay the full $1,140,000 taken from the 4 elderly investors, and a permanent bar from ever working in any capacity within the insurance or financial services industries again. I attended his sentencing hearing, sitting 4 rows back, close enough to watch him age visibly across the 90 minutes of proceedings, and when the judge asked if he had anything to say, he turned, briefly, and looked at me and said nothing at all, which felt, somehow, like the most honest interaction we'd ever had. I want to describe that sentencing hearing in more detail, because it was, in many ways, the moment where the abstraction of everything I'd spent months investigating finally became fully, physically real in a way even the wedding itself hadn't managed to be. The federal courthouse in New Haven had none of the grandeur people imagine from television, fluorescent lighting, worn carpet, a room that smelled faintly of old paper and cleaning solvent, and I sat, as I said, 4 rows back, close enough to see the specific way my father's hands trembled slightly against the defense table. A tremor I recognized, having developed one of my own during those 6 weeks of investigation, and felt a brief, unwelcome flicker of something almost like pity before I remembered, deliberately, precisely why I was in that room. Before sentencing, the judge allowed victim impact statements, and Harold Bregman stood first, adjusting his reading glasses with hands that shook slightly more than my father's, and read, in a voice that grew steadier as he continued, a statement describing exactly what that $190,000 had represented. Not an abstraction, but the specific, concrete plan he and his late wife had built together over 30 years of careful saving. a plan to help fund his granddaughter's college education, a plan that no longer existed in any recoverable form because of a decision my father had made in a country club dining room, over appetizers, weighing another man's entire retirement against his own son's lifestyle, and finding it, apparently, an acceptable trade. Wanda Pruitt spoke next, describing 31 years in a classroom and what it meant to watch that specific, hard-won security evaporate because of, in her words, a family that had every advantage I never had, and still wasn't satisfied with what they already owned. I watched my father's face throughout both statements, and I want to tell you he looked devastated, genuinely remorseful, but I don't think that would be honest. He looked instead uncomfortable, the specific discomfort of a man being forced to sit through consequences rather than a man actually absorbing what he'd done. And I remember thinking, watching him, that this distinction between looking sorry and being sorry was perhaps the single clearest thing that entire case had taught me about him. When the judge finally read the sentence, 6 years, along with the restitution order and the permanent industry bar, my father did not react visibly at all, and I understood, watching him, that whatever performance of respectability had sustained him for 3 decades had finally completely run out of material, leaving behind only a tired, aging man in a rumpled suit who had spent his entire adult life building an image so carefully that he'd apparently never gotten around to building anything real underneath it. Julian was charged alongside him, and because his role, while real, was demonstrably subordinate, that of an ill-equipped frontman manipulated by a father who had orchestrated the deeper structure of the fraud, his attorney negotiated a considerably lighter outcome: 18 months in a minimum security federal facility, 3 years of supervised probation afterward, and a restitution obligation of his own, calculated at $412,000, a number that struck me, when I first read it in the plea documents, as a strange, almost poetic symmetry, since it was, near enough, the exact cost of the wedding itself. Julian wrote me one letter from prison, 5 months into his sentence, which I have kept, unanswered, in the same manila folder that once held the evidence against him, and in it, he did not apologize, not directly, but he wrote one sentence that I think, in its own limited way, was the closest thing to self-awareness he had ever produced. I don't think I ever once asked what it cost you to make sure I never had to figure anything out for myself. I read that letter perhaps 11 times over the following month, sitting with it the way I'd once sat with the DNA results in that parking garage, trying to determine what, if anything, I actually owed the sentence in response. Julian's letter continued for 2 more paragraphs, describing, in flat institutional prose, what his days inside the facility looked like, a job in the prison's small furniture workshop that he said, with what read like genuine surprise, he was actually decent at. A detail that struck me as almost unbearably sad given that decades of comfort had apparently ensured Julian never once discovered he might have been capable of ordinary competence if anyone had simply required it of him earlier. He closed the letter with a single line, "I have still to this day not fully decided how to feel about. I don't expect you to write back. I don't think I've earned that yet, and I'm not sure I ever will. But I wanted you to know I finally understand what the word role actually meant, because I've had 18 months with nothing to do but think about how much of mine you were carrying the whole time." I did not write back, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely did not yet know what an honest response would even say. I showed the letter to Dr. Feldstein during a session roughly a month later, and she asked me a question I found unexpectedly clarifying. "Do you think forgiving him would mean you were wrong to do what you did?" I told her no, immediately, without hesitation, that the two things had never actually been connected in my mind at all. "Then maybe," she said, "the letter isn't asking you to decide anything today. Maybe it's just sitting there, waiting for whichever version of you eventually has room for it." I still have not written back 18 months later, but I have also not thrown the letter away, and I think, for now, that unfinished, unresolved space is simply the most honest place I can leave it. A small, open loop in a life where I finally, deliberately, stopped closing every loop the moment it became uncomfortable to leave open. Trevor Ashcombe, whose role was narrower but still criminal, having knowingly opened fraudulent accounts in exchange for payment, received a sentence of 8 months and a permanent felony record that ended, definitively, his career in any financial-adjacent industry. I heard, secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance nearly a year later, that Trevor had taken a job managing a car rental counter at Bradley International Airport, a detail I did not seek out but did not mind hearing, either, given everything. Sylvia Cho was never criminally charged, since her relationship to the fraud was personal rather than financial, No direct evidence linking her to knowing participation in the Meridian Crest scheme itself. But the affair became public knowledge across the entire extended social circle my parents had spent 3 decades cultivating. And Sylvia, I learned, quietly relocated to Charlotte, North Carolina, roughly 8 months later, severing all contact with everyone in Connecticut, including notably my father, who reportedly attempted to reach her twice from prison and was refused both times. I want to add one more detail about Trevor here, because I learned it much later, almost by accident, through the same mutual acquaintance who'd told me about the car rental counter at Bradley International. Apparently, in the months following his release, Trevor had attempted to rebuild some version of his old confidence by telling a modified version of the entire story at a bar, framing himself, absurdly, as an unwitting victim who'd simply trusted the wrong friend. A version of events that unraveled almost immediately when someone at the bar who'd actually followed the case in the local news corrected him publicly, in front of everyone, and Trevor apparently left without finishing his drink. I did not feel any particular satisfaction hearing this, only a kind of tired recognition that some people, even after losing everything, still reach first for the version of the story that lets them avoid the discomfort of the truth, and that the truth, eventually, tends to find them anyway, in bars, at family funerals, in courtrooms, wherever they've tried hardest to outrun it. My mother faced no criminal charges either, since the fraud itself had been orchestrated primarily by my father, but the social consequences, in the specific, insular world of a Connecticut country club community, proved almost as total as a prison sentence would have been. Within 4 months of the wedding, my mother had been quietly, informally excluded from the club's social calendar. Her invitations to the events that had structured her entire adult identity simply stopped arriving, and Aunt Colette, whose loyalty, it turned out, had always been thinner than her arrogance suggested, distanced herself from my mother almost entirely within the year, choosing, transparently, to preserve her own standing rather than defend a sister whose family had become a source of gossip rather than aspiration. My mother called me exactly once, 7 months after the wedding, and asked, without any preamble, whether I could help her understand the finances, since she had discovered, belatedly, that most of the family's remaining assets had been frozen or seized as part of the restitution proceedings. I told her, calmly, that I was not available to help and I have not spoken to her since, a silence that has now lasted, at the time I'm telling you this story, just over 14 months. Uncle Ted, whose $43,000 debt to my parents was, understandably, never going to be repaid given everything that followed, tried once, at a mutual cousin's funeral 8 months after the wedding, to approach me and suggest that families should stick together no matter what. And I looked at him, this man who had once told me, without apparent shame, that he'd have Julian's guy look at his business plan, because Julian was plugged into real money now. And I said only, "Where was that philosophy for the first 31 years, Ted?" He did not have an answer, and he has not attempted to contact me since. Aunt Colette, meanwhile, sent me a single card roughly a year after the wedding, unprompted, containing no apology, only a vague, carefully worded note about how families go through difficult seasons, and how she hoped we could all move forward eventually. A message so thoroughly stripped of any actual accountability that I recognized it instantly as the same performance she'd delivered at every family gathering for 2 decades, simply repackaged for a smaller audience. I did not respond. I kept the card, briefly, in the same drawer where I kept Julian's letter, before eventually deciding the two did not belong in the same category at all. One, an imperfect but genuine reckoning, the other simply another costume, and I threw Colette's card away without a second thought. The first time in my entire life I had discarded anything from that family without agonizing over whether I was allowed to. As for me, the months following the wedding were, unexpectedly, the most professionally transformative period of my entire career. The Meridian Crest case, once public record, drew significant attention within the forensic accounting community, not because of the family drama, which I kept scrupulously out of professional conversations, but because of the methodology I had used, tracing shell entities through public filings and cross-referencing property records with banking relationships, using nothing but publicly accessible tools and disciplined patience. Whitmore Ridley Associates promoted me to Director of Forensic Investigations 11 months after the wedding, a role that came with a base salary of $280,000, nearly a 50% increase and considerably more autonomy over which cases I chose to pursue. I also began, quietly, consulting on elder fraud prevention with a nonprofit organization based in New Haven, Work that felt, to me, like the closest thing to closure I would ever get regarding the 4 retirees my father and brother had harmed. People I never met but thought about often. Particularly Harold Bregman, the retired dentist whose complaint had first opened the FBI's investigation. A man I finally spoke with directly, months later, over coffee, who told me simply, "You didn't have to do any of what you did, you know. You could have just walked away and let the FBI handle the rest." I told him the truth, which was that walking away had never actually been available to me. Not really, not once I understood the full shape of what my own silence would have protected. I want to add one final detail about that coffee with Harold Bregman, because it's the exchange that, more than any courtroom moment, has stayed with me longest. Near the end of our conversation, Harold asked me, almost shyly, whether I'd be willing to speak at a community seminar he was helping organize through his church, aimed at teaching other retirees how to recognize the early signs of affinity fraud before it took hold. And I said yes immediately, without hesitation, and spoke at that seminar 4 months later to a room of nearly 60 people, most of them over 65, walking them through the exact red flags I had learned to recognize professionally: vague fund names, unregistered advisors, recommendations that leaned on social trust rather than documented performance. Afterward, an elderly woman I did not recognize approached me, thanked me quietly, and told me she had in fact been approached by someone at her own social club just weeks earlier with an investment opportunity that now, having heard me speak, she recognized as almost certainly fraudulent, and that she had decided, that same week, not to invest. I drove home that night thinking about Wanda Pruitt's classroom photograph, about the specific shape of the harm I had spent months tracing through spreadsheets, and understanding, fully, for the first time, that the version of justice I had actually built was not contained inside that one ballroom in Litchfield County. It had simply started there. I want to tell you about Priya specifically, because out of everyone touched by that single ruined afternoon in Litchfield County, she is the person whose story surprised me the most. Her marriage to Julian was annulled 6 weeks after the wedding, a process made considerably simpler by the fact that Julian was, by then, already in federal custody and unable to contest much of anything. I did not speak to Priya for nearly 4 months after the wedding, respecting the distance she had asked for that night, but she reached out first, in October, with a short, careful text that said only, "Would you want to get coffee sometime? Not as family, just as 2 people who went through something together." We met at a small cafe in New Haven, near the hospital where she was finishing her dermatology residency, and I remember she looked lighter than she had at the wedding. Not happier exactly, but unburdened in a specific way, the way people look after they've stopped carrying something they were never actually responsible for. Over the following year, Priya and I built something neither of us had a name for at first, not quite friendship in the ordinary sense, since our entire connection had been forged in the wreckage of a marriage that never truly began, but something adjacent to it, forged instead in a shared understanding of what it costs to discover the people closest to you were never who you believed them to be. She eventually told me, on our 3rd or 4th coffee meeting, that she had started her own process of tracing back through her memories of Julian, looking for the moments she should have seen more clearly, the small evasions about his job, the vague answers about the fund, and she said something that stayed with me. "I think I wanted so badly for the version of him I fell in love with to be real that I stopped asking the questions that would have told me it wasn't. I don't think that makes me stupid. I think it just makes me someone who trusted the wrong performance." I told her I understood that better than almost anyone alive, having spent 27 years trusting a performance of my own family's love that turned out to be built on the exact same kind of convenient, protective blindness. Deepak Anand, Priya's grandfather, became, unexpectedly, a kind of distant but genuine presence in my life over the following year, calling occasionally, sending a card on my birthday, the first birthday card I had received from anyone connected to that entire extended family circle in over a decade. And on the 1-year anniversary of the wedding, he invited me to a small family dinner, not out of obligation, he told me plainly on the phone, but because, in his words, "Blood is a strange thing, Naomi, and I find I would like to know the granddaughter of my late cousin, whatever the circumstances that brought her into my life." I went. It was, I think, the first time in my adult life I sat at a family dinner table and felt, without qualification, that I was wanted there rather than tolerated there. And the difference, I discovered, sitting in Mira and Rajiv's dining room eating a curry Mira had made specifically, she told me, because Priya had mentioned it was my favorite, was not subtle at all. It was the difference between a lifetime of one thing and a single evening of an entirely different thing. And I remember driving home that night and crying for the first time since the wedding. Not from grief, but from something closer to relief. The specific relief of finally understanding, in my body and not just my mind, what an actual family was supposed to feel like. I want to describe that dinner in more detail because the small, ordinary specifics of it are, I think, exactly what makes it matter. Mira Anand had, without my knowing, called Priya beforehand to ask what I actually liked to eat, a small act of consideration so foreign to me that I didn't fully register its significance until I was sitting at their table watching Mira serve a chicken curry, made precisely the way I preferred it, mild, heavy on cilantro, exactly as I'd once mentioned, in passing months earlier, to Priya over coffee. Rajiv asked me, over dinner, detailed, genuinely curious questions about my work. Not the vague, dismissive interest my own father had shown when he asked at all, but real questions, follow-up questions, the kind that told me he'd actually been listening to my answers rather than waiting for his turn to talk about something else. Priya sat beside me for most of the evening, and at one point, refilling my water glass without being asked, said quietly, "Just for me, I used to think family was something you were just born into and had to accept whatever shape it came in. I don't think that anymore. I think you get to choose who actually gets to keep that word, eventually, if the people who had it first didn't earn it." End quote. I did not have a response ready for that sentence. I simply nodded and let myself, for the first time in longer than I could remember, feel entirely, uncomplicatedly welcome in a room full of people who had no obligation to make me feel that way, and chose to anyway. I also want to tell you about the 4 elderly investors, because their story matters more than mine in the accounting of what this entire case actually meant. Harold Bregman, the retired dentist, received his full restitution 11 months after my father's sentencing, funded through the forced liquidation of my father's remaining assets, including, notably, the sale of the Ashford Lane house I had grown up in. A sale that felt, when I learned of it, like watching a specific chapter of my life get formally, legally closed. The other 3 investors, a retired schoolteacher named Wanda Pruitt, a widowed pharmacist named Alton Reyes, no relation to the agent, and a semi-retired contractor named Frank DiMaggio, each received their restitution in full over the following 18 months. And I met 2 of them, Wanda and Frank, at a small gathering the New Haven nonprofit organized once the case formally closed. And Wanda took my hand at that gathering and said something I have thought about often since. "You didn't have to be the one to fix this. You could have let it be someone else's problem. I want you to know that the fact you didn't matters more than you probably understand." I did not tell her, in that moment, the full personal cost of what fixing it had actually required, the family I had lost in the process, but I did tell her that watching her receive her money back, in full, was worth every single one of those 4 months of sleepless nights, and I meant it entirely. Frank DiMaggio, the semi-retired contractor, told me something different that same afternoon, standing near the refreshment table with a paper cup of coffee he never quite got around to drinking. He told me he'd spent 41 years building other people's houses, careful, physical, honest work, and that losing $63,000 to Meridian Crest hadn't just cost him money, it had cost him something closer to faith. The basic assumption that a recommendation from someone at his own club, someone whose family he'd known for years, could be trusted at face value. "I keep thinking about how easy it was for them," he said, looking past me toward the parking lot, not quite at me. "Your brother didn't even have to lie well. He just had to look like the kind of person who wouldn't. That's the part that gets me. Not the money. The fact that I've spent 4 decades learning to trust a handshake, and one afternoon at a fundraiser undid all of it." I did not have a tidy response to that, because I don't think there is one, and I told him only that I understood, better than he probably realized, what it costs to discover that the appearance of trustworthiness and the reality of it are sometimes 2 entirely unrelated things, worn by the same people, in the same rooms, for years, without anyone noticing the difference until it's far too late to matter. I think about that conversation with Frank often, more honestly than I think about most of what happened inside my own family, because it reframed the entire case for me in a way nothing else had. This was never simply a story about my parents and my brother. It was a story about how thoroughly the appearance of respectability can function as a weapon, how a country club membership and a firm handshake and 3 decades of quiet civic presence can build a kind of armor that lets fraud walk directly past people's instincts. People who spent their entire lives being careful, being reasonable, being exactly the kind of cautious that should have protected them. My father did not succeed because he was clever. He succeeded because he understood, better than almost anyone I've ever studied professionally, that people extend trust based on appearance long before they extend it based on evidence. And he had spent 3 decades curating an appearance specifically, deliberately, built to be trusted. There is a version of this story, I think, that other people might have told with more anger in it, and I want to be honest about why mine doesn't have that anger, or at least not in the way you might expect. I am not, in any meaningful sense, at peace with what my parents did to me across 27 years. The years of ironed shirts and packed lunches and a childhood spent auditioning for a love that was never actually available to me on any terms. But I stopped, sometime around the 6-month mark after the wedding, needing that anger to organize itself into forgiveness or reconciliation, because I came to understand that those two things were never actually the point. The point, I think, was simply stopping. Stopping the performance, stopping the audition, stopping the specific, exhausting labor of trying to earn something from people who had already decided, before I could speak, what I was allowed to be worth. I bought my own house 14 months after the wedding, a modest 3-bedroom colonial in Fairfield, paid for entirely with money I earned myself, tracing fraud for other families' broken finances, and I remember standing in the empty living room on closing day, no furniture yet, just afternoon light coming through bare windows, and thinking about the 6-bedroom colonial on Ashford Lane, where I had once been told, at 14 years old, that some children are born to serve. I thought about the version of me that grew up in that house believing her function was to be useful rather than loved, and I thought about how strange it was that the same skills that house had forced me to develop out of survival, precision, patience, and almost obsessive attention to the gap between what people say and what the evidence actually shows, had become, eventually, the exact tools I used to walk myself and 4 elderly strangers out of the wreckage that same house had quietly been building for years. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I've been asked that question more times than I can count since the case became, briefly, local news in Connecticut, it isn't really about revenge, even though I know that's the word most people reach for when they hear this story. It's something quieter than that. It's the understanding that the people who tell you what you're worth, especially the people who do it early, in a kitchen, when you're small enough to believe them completely, are not actually describing some fixed truth about you. They're describing what's convenient for them. And the day you finally understand the difference between those two things is the day you stop performing a role you were never actually obligated to play. I think about my mother's voice sometimes, still, saying some children are born to serve, and I think about how long it took me to understand that sentence wasn't a fact about me at all. It was just the sound a house makes right before it starts to fall. I want to tell you about my grandmother Estelle before I close this out, because she is, in some ways, the only unambiguous good in this entire story. The one person in the older generation who had tried, quietly, for years, to name what was happening to me before I had the tools to name it myself. Estelle passed away 8 months after the wedding, of causes unrelated to any of this, simply age and a heart that had finally worn itself out at 86, and I was the one who sat with her in the hospital during her final week. Not my mother, who called twice but visited only once, briefly, and not Julian, who was, by then, still in federal custody and unable to attend at all. Estelle, in one of her last lucid conversations, held my hand and said, "I always knew you'd be the one who turned out solid, Naomi. Diane built that whole house on performance, and performances collapse eventually. They always do. But you were always building something real underneath, even when nobody was watching you do it. I'm sorry it took your family losing everything for anyone to finally notice." I inherited, from Estelle, a modest sum, $31,000 and a set of pearl earrings that had belonged to her own mother. And I want you to understand that those pearl earrings, not the country club membership, not the 6-bedroom colonial, not any of the appearance my parents spent 3 decades constructing, are the only inheritance from that entire extended family that I have ever worn with anything resembling pride. I want to describe that final week in the hospital in more detail, because it holds, I think, some of the most honest hours of my entire life. I brought a small radio to Estelle's room, since the hospital television reception was poor, and we listened, most afternoons, to an old jazz station she'd loved for decades, and between songs she told me stories I had never heard before. About her own mother, about a summer she'd spent in Montreal at 19, about a marriage proposal she'd turned down at 23, from a man she said she'd loved but hadn't trusted. A detail that made me look at her differently, understanding, suddenly, that she too had once stood at the exact fork in the road my own mother had faced, and had simply chosen differently. On the fourth day, she asked me, directly, whether I regretted what had happened at the wedding, and I told her, honestly, that I regretted the cost, Marcus. The version of my family I'd once hoped might still become real, but that I did not regret the truth itself. And Estelle squeezed my hand, weaker than it had been even the day before, and said, "That's the only kind of answer that means anything, Naomi. Anyone can tell you they have no regrets. It takes an honest person to tell you exactly what the regret cost, and choose it anyway." I started seeing a therapist 5 months after the wedding, a decision I resisted for a long time out of the same stubborn self-sufficiency that had let me build an entire federal case alone, at night, without telling a single person outside of Rosalind and Agent Okonkwo Reyes what I was carrying. My therapist, a calm, unhurried woman named Dr. Feldstein, asked me in one of our earliest sessions whether I felt guilty about what happened to my father and brother, and I remember sitting with that question for a long time before answering honestly. "I don't feel guilty about the consequences," I told her. "I feel guilty sometimes that I don't feel guilty. I think I was supposed to cry more. I think I was supposed to want reconciliation more than I actually want it." Dr. Feldstein told me something that has stayed with me since, that the specific coldness I had learned to survive in that house wasn't a flaw I needed to apologize for, it was armor I had built out of necessity, at a very young age, and that armor doesn't simply dissolve the moment the threat is gone. It takes time, real time, sometimes years, to learn which parts of it you actually still need, and which parts you can finally, safely set down. I remember, several months into that work with Dr. Feldstein, a session where she asked me to describe, in physical detail, what safety would actually feel like in my body, since I had told her, repeatedly, that I understood the concept intellectually, but had never once, in 31 years, actually experienced it as a felt sense rather than an idea. I sat with that question for nearly the entire session, unable to answer it until finally, near the end, I described a specific memory, not from childhood, but from the week after the wedding, sitting in my own apartment with the door locked, no meetings to prepare for, no evidence to gather, simply sitting on my couch in complete, ordinary silence, and realizing, for the first time in my adult life, that nothing was about to be required of me. Dr. Feldstein told me that description, small and unremarkable as it sounded, was in fact the most important thing I'd said in months, because it meant my body had finally, however briefly, remembered what safety actually felt like, and that the work ahead was simply teaching it to trust that feeling enough to return to it, without needing a crisis to have passed first. Rosalind and I remained close after the case formally concluded, meeting for dinner every few months, and at one of those dinners, nearly a year after the wedding, she told me something I hadn't known, that Agent Okonkwo Reyes had specifically requested. Afterward, that the Bureau's outreach materials on elder financial fraud include a case study based on my investigation, anonymized, as an example of how forensic professionals in the general public could meaningfully assist federal investigations without compromising their integrity. I felt, hearing that, a specific, quiet pride that had nothing to do with my family at all. A pride built entirely on the actual value of the work itself, separate from any relationship, any inheritance, any childhood role I had once been assigned. It was, I think, the first time in my life that a version of my worth existed completely outside the walls of that house on Ashford Lane, untethered from anyone's approval, built instead on something I could actually verify, the way I verify everything, with evidence, with outcomes, with numbers that don't lie even when people do. On what would have been the second anniversary of the wedding, I did something small but, for me, significant. I drove out to Litchfield County, to the Ridgeview Manor, not for any event, simply to walk the grounds on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, past the same garden where the white peonies had bloomed 2 years earlier, and I stood on that terrace for a long while, watching an entirely different wedding party set up chairs for an entirely different couple's ceremony, strangers whose lives had nothing to do with mine, and I felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as completion. Not happiness exactly, not triumph, but the specific, solid feeling of a case finally, fully closed, every loose thread accounted for, every number reconciled. I thought about the 11-year-old girl who had once run home with a brass trophy nobody photographed, and I thought about the 31-year-old woman standing on that terrace, who had built, alone, out of nothing but patience and evidence, and a refusal to keep performing a role she never agreed to, an entirely new foundation for her own life, one nobody could quietly donate away in a storage bag while she wasn't looking. I want to add one more thread to this before I close, because it feels, in some ways, like the truest measure of everything that changed. Roughly a year and a half after the wedding, Whitmore Ridley Associates asked me to begin mentoring junior forensic accountants joining the firm, and I said yes, somewhat to my own surprise, since mentoring had never been something I'd actively sought out before, having spent most of my career simply proving myself quietly, alone, the way I'd been trained to operate since childhood. My first mentee was a 24-year-old named Priyanka Desai, sharp, meticulous, and, in a detail that struck me immediately, visibly nervous about asking questions, apologizing reflexively before nearly every request for guidance, a pattern I recognized instantly, having spent 31 years apologizing for taking up space in rooms where I'd been taught, early and thoroughly, that my presence was conditional. I found myself, over the following months, deliberately, consciously building something with Priyanka that nobody had ever built with me. Patient explanation without irritation, genuine credit for good work stated plainly rather than withheld as leverage. The simple, radical act of telling a young woman, directly, that her instincts were sound before she'd even finished doubting them out loud. 6 months into working together, Priyanka caught a discrepancy in a client's inventory valuation that ended up uncovering a significant embezzlement scheme, her first real catch, and I remember the specific look on her face when I told her, plainly, in front of the entire department, that the discovery was entirely hers, that I'd simply been in the room. She teared up, briefly, in the hallway afterward, and told me she'd never had anyone hand her credit so completely without asking for a share of it, and I told her, honestly, that I intended to keep doing exactly that for as long as she worked with me, because I understood, better than most people ever could, the specific, quiet damage of spending years being told your best work still somehow belonged to someone else. So I'll ask you the same question I've been sitting with for over a year now. The one I still don't have a complete answer to, even after everything. If you found out tomorrow that the family who raised you had built your entire sense of worth on a foundation they knew, the whole time, was a lie, would you have the courage to stop performing the role they assigned you, even knowing exactly how much it would cost you to walk away? You've sat through this entire story, every loop, every reveal, every single receipt I laid out for you, which means some part of you already believes people like my mother deserve to have the truth finally catch up to them. And if you believe that, you already know what happens in the video queued up right after this one. The one about the husband who thought his wife's quiet, unassuming demeanor at the office meant she'd never notice the second bank account, the burner phone, the storage unit he thought no one would ever find. Comment part 2 below right now if you want it.